I spent most of that summer looking for a place where I could be alone for a few weeks. I had been working too much, sleeping too little, and spending too many hours staring at screens. My head felt heavy all the time, my chest always tight. I wanted a quiet place somewhere far from people, where I could sleep when I wanted, walk in the woods, and not hear anything but wind or water. I found a small cabin listed on a local website that looked perfect. It was far from any town, sitting by a lake deep inside a forest valley. The pictures showed an old wooden cabin with a metal roof, a deck facing the lake, and nothing else around for miles. The listing said there was no phone signal, no Wi-Fi, and that the only way to reach it was by a rough dirt road that went through the woods for almost 8 miles. That sounded perfect to me. I packed a few bags, a cooler full of food, my fishing gear, a small generator, and enough supplies to stay for a week or more. The drive from the main highway to the cabin took longer than I thought. The dirt road was rough, covered with rocks and roots, and in some places the trees leaned so close that I had to drive slowly to avoid scratching the car. I didn't see another vehicle the whole way. When I finally reached the end of the road, I saw the cabin just like it looked in the pictures. It sat near the edge of the lake, surrounded by tall pine and birch trees. The water was calm and dark, with a layer of mist floating above it. The only sounds were the wind and a few birds calling somewhere far off. The cabin itself looked old but sturdy. The wood was dark from years of weather, and the roof looked newer, like someone had replaced it recently. There was a small porch with 2 steps leading up to the front door. Inside it was simple, one big main room with a bed, a small table, a few chairs, and an old wood stove in the corner. The kitchen area had a sink, a counter, and a small propane stove. A narrow door led to a tiny bathroom with a shower that used lake water and a compost toilet. It was quiet and still inside, with that faint musty smell that old cabins get when no one lives in them for long periods. The first evening was peaceful. I unpacked everything, set up my cooler near the stove, and walked down to the lake to wash my hands. The water was cold and clear. I sat on a rock near the shore for a while, watching the sun go down behind the trees. The whole sky turned orange, then pink, and finally a deep blue. The surface of the lake turned completely smooth, like glass. When I walked back to the cabin, I saw my reflection in the windows, faint and distorted by the dim light inside. I went to bed early that night, listening to the sounds outside, the wind in the trees, a few frogs croaking, and once in a while something small moving through the leaves. The first couple of days went well. I woke up late, made coffee, and spent most of the day walking around the woods or fishing at the lake. The weather was mild, sometimes cloudy but warm enough to sit outside for hours. I wrote a little in my notebook, took pictures, and cooked simple meals. It felt good to be disconnected from everything. I didn't check my phone once because there was no signal anyway. But after the 3rd day, I started noticing small things that made me uneasy. The first thing was the marks near the edge of the lake. At first, I thought they were animal tracks. I saw them when I went down to the water early in the morning. Small, uneven impressions in the wet mud that looked like footprints. Not animal tracks, but human. The shape was faint, but they were spaced too far apart for any animal. They led down to the water and stopped there. I figured maybe some other person had been at the cabin before me and walked down there, but I hadn't seen another vehicle or any sign of people since I arrived. Still, I didn't think much of it. That night, though, I woke up to a noise outside. It was faint, like something bumping against the side of the cabin. I lay still, listening. It happened again. A soft thud, then silence. I thought maybe a branch had fallen, or an animal brushed against the wall. I didn't get up. The wind was strong, and old cabins make sounds when the wood expands and moves. I tried to ignore it and eventually fell asleep again. The next morning, when I stepped outside, I saw something that made me stop. There were fresh footprints in the dirt near the steps. They were clear this time, like someone had walked there recently. Bare feet, not boots or shoes. The tracks went around the side of the cabin and disappeared into the trees. I stood there for a long time, staring at them. The ground was damp from the night dew, so they couldn't have been old. Someone had walked there while I was sleeping. I looked around the woods but didn't see anyone. Everything was still and quiet. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I kept telling myself that maybe they were mine from an earlier walk or from someone who stayed before me. But I knew they weren't. They were too fresh. That night, I locked the cabin door, even though the lock was small and weak. I pushed a chair against it just to feel better. I left the small lantern burning inside, which I hadn't done before. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound outside made me freeze. Once I thought I heard something moving near the porch again. Faint steps in the dirt. I didn't move, didn't breathe for a while, listening. After a few minutes, the sound stopped. I stared at the ceiling for a long time before I finally fell asleep again near dawn. When I woke up in the morning, I went outside and saw more footprints. They were right at the bottom of the steps again, like whoever it was had stood there for a while. I felt a wave of nausea when I saw that they pointed toward the door, not away from it. The dirt near the steps was disturbed, like someone had shifted their weight back and forth. I checked around the cabin and saw that the footprints went a few feet around the back, then vanished into the grass and leaves. I decided to walk around the area, just to make sure no one was camping nearby. I went through the woods for about half a mile, following the path that led back toward the dirt road. I didn't find any tents, no signs of people, no vehicles. The woods were silent except for the wind. When I came back, the lake looked completely still, and the cabin looked smaller, darker, like it was sinking into the shadows. That evening, I moved my cooler and gear inside and shut all the windows. The air felt heavy and still, and the woods outside seemed darker than usual. I tried reading to distract myself, but I kept glancing toward the door. The quiet was almost unbearable, the kind where every tiny sound feels louder than it should. Around midnight, I heard it again, a faint creak from the porch. Then another sound, like something brushing against the wall near the window. I sat up in bed, holding still. The lantern light flickered slightly. For a long moment, there was only silence, then a very faint tap, like a finger against glass. My chest felt tight, my breathing shallow. I stared at the window but saw nothing. It stopped after a few minutes. I didn't move until the first light started to show through the trees. When I finally stepped outside in the morning, I saw the same prints again, but this time they were clearer, deeper in the dirt, leading from the edge of the woods to the porch. The grass near the trees was pressed down too, as if someone had been standing there for a while, watching. That was the day I decided I should probably leave. I started packing some of my things, but then realized that the car's battery was nearly dead. I had left the dome light on the previous day without noticing. I tried starting it, but it only clicked weakly. I had a small jump starter in my bag, but it wasn't charged. I cursed myself for not checking it earlier. The cabin didn't have power except for the generator, and that only worked for lights and small appliances, not for charging the car. The nearest town was at least 20 miles away. I tried not to panic. I figured I could charge the jump starter using the generator during the day, then try again in the evening. That gave me at least one more night there. I spent most of the day keeping busy, cutting wood, cleaning, pretending everything was normal. I kept the axe near the bed that night. As the sun went down, I felt that same uneasy pressure again, like the air was thicker than usual. The woods were quiet in a strange way. No birds, no frogs, not even the usual rustling leaves. I kept the lantern burning bright inside and waited. The hours passed slowly. At some point, I must have dozed off because I woke up suddenly to the sound of something being dragged outside. It was faint but steady, like something heavy sliding through the dirt. My heart started pounding. I sat up and listened, stopped, then started again closer to the wall. I stood up quietly, picked up the axe, and moved closer to the window. I didn't see anything at first. The lantern light cast reflections that made it hard to see outside. Then, just for a moment, I thought I saw movement near the treeline. A shape, maybe a person, crouched low. I blinked and it was gone. I didn't hear anything else for the rest of the night, but I didn't sleep again either. In the morning, I went outside and found something that made my stomach twist. The ground near the treeline had drag marks, 2 long grooves leading from the woods toward the side of the cabin, then stopping near the wall. It looked like something had been pulled along the dirt. Next to the marks were more footprints, bare ones again, and small bits of broken bark. I walked around the cabin and saw something else. The door to the small storage shed behind the cabin was open. I hadn't even touched that shed since I arrived. Inside, everything was dusty and old. Some tools, a broken fishing rod, and a few rusted cans. But on the floor near the back wall, there was a piece of tarp that looked newer, like someone had been there recently. I closed the shed door and went back inside, locking everything again. My hands were shaking. I spent most of that day sitting near the window, watching the trees, waiting for movement. Nothing happened. The day passed slowly, and by evening I managed to get the jump starter charged. I decided I would leave early in the morning, right after sunrise. That night felt endless. I kept hearing small noises, branches snapping, faint crunching in the leaves. Around 2 in the morning, I thought I heard soft footsteps again on the porch, slower this time. The sound stopped right near the door, and then came a faint scraping, like something brushing against the wood. I stood there with the axe in my hands, not moving, my mouth dry. The sound stopped, then came again, softer. I waited, counting the seconds, then silence. When morning finally came, I opened the door and saw that the dirt near the steps was freshly disturbed again. Whoever it was had been standing there for a long time. The prints were deep and uneven, and one of them had a small smear, like a heel had twisted in the dirt. I started the generator, hooked up the jump starter, and went to the car. When the engine finally turned over, I felt a wave of relief so strong it almost made me dizzy. I loaded my things as fast as I could. Before leaving, I took one last look at the cabin. The lake was still, the mist rising slowly off the water, and the woods were completely silent. Everything looked calm, almost too calm, like nothing had happened at all. I got in the car and started driving back down the dirt road. After a few minutes, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Through the trees, I could still see the cabin roof glinting faintly in the sunlight. Then I saw something else. On the edge of the clearing, near the treeline, there was a shape. A person standing there, half hidden by the shadows. It was hard to see details from that distance, but I could tell they were barefoot. I pressed the gas harder and didn't look back again. The road felt longer on the way out. Every bump and turn made the car shake, and I kept expecting to see someone step out onto the road ahead. But I didn't. When I finally reached the main road, I stopped for a moment and just sat there, breathing. The silence in the car felt strange after all those nights of tension. I drove straight to town and found a small gas station. When I stepped out, my legs were shaking. I went inside, bought some water, and sat in the car for almost an hour before I could bring myself to keep driving. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I just said the place felt weird and that I didn't want to stay. A week later, I couldn't stop thinking about it, so I looked up the cabin listing again. It was gone from the website. I tried searching for the address but couldn't find it anywhere. Not on maps, not on any rental site. I called the number from the original listing, but it went straight to a disconnected message. I never went back, and I never told anyone about the footprints or the sounds. But sometimes, when I wake up at night, I still see the image in my head. The faint marks in the dirt near the door, the drag lines near the wall, and that figure standing motionless at the edge of the woods as I drove away. I think about how quiet it was that morning, how calm everything looked, how it almost felt like the forest was holding its breath. I've told myself 1,000 times it was just some stranger passing through, maybe a drifter or someone camping nearby. But there's something that never sits right. The fact that whoever it was never tried to take anything, never broke in, never left a trace except for those footprints. It's been 2 years now, but sometimes when I park my car at night and step out, I find myself glancing at the ground near my porch, half expecting to see faint prints in the dirt, the shape of bare feet, facing the door, waiting. I decided to spend a week alone in a small cabin deep in the mountains of northern Idaho. I had rented it online, a single-room place that looked simple but clean. The photos showed a wood stove, a bed against the wall, a small kitchen area, and a table near a window facing a wide valley. I wanted the quiet more than anything else. I had been feeling burnt out from work, and I thought being cut off from everything might help. The drive up took almost 5 hours from the nearest small town. The road turned to dirt about halfway through, and the last few miles were covered in patches of snow and ice. I had a 4-wheel drive truck, and I had brought extra gas, food, and firewood just in case. I reached the cabin in the late afternoon, just as the sun was sliding behind the trees. It sat on a clearing of flat land surrounded by thick pine forest. There was no sign of any other cabin nearby, and the nearest neighbor, according to the owner, was about 7 miles down the road. The cabin was smaller than it had looked online. The wood was old and dark, the roof covered in a thin layer of snow. The steps creaked as I walked up. Inside, it smelled of cold wood and faint smoke, like someone had burned pine logs recently. There was a single bed, a small table, a propane stove, and a metal box stove for heat. There was no power. The owner had left a few lanterns and extra propane canisters near the wall. I unpacked slowly, trying to make the place feel a bit like home. I stacked my food in the corner, lined up the water jugs I'd brought, and set my sleeping bag on top of the bed. The air inside was freezing. I started a fire right away and waited for the stove to heat up. The silence around me was heavy. Not peaceful silence, but something so complete that even the crackle of firewood sounded too loud. I remember standing there for a long time, listening to the way the wind brushed against the cabin walls. That first night passed quietly. I slept well, probably from exhaustion after the long drive. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of the wind hitting the windows and snow tapping the roof. It was colder than I expected, and I had to get up to throw another log into the stove. I checked my phone out of habit, but there was no service, just like the owner had said. I crawled back into bed and stared at the dark ceiling until I fell asleep again. The next morning, I went outside to explore. The snow had deepened overnight, covering the ground in a thin, clean sheet. The tracks from my truck were already fading. I walked down a small path that led into the woods behind the cabin. The air was quiet again, and every sound carried. My boots crunching, the shifting of branches, the soft hum of wind. I didn't go too far. It was easy to get lost here. When I came back, I noticed something small that bothered me. The latch on the cabin's door was slightly open. I was sure I had locked it when I left, since I remembered testing it before heading out. I thought maybe the wood had warped and made it spring loose. It didn't feel like a big deal. I brushed it off, made some breakfast on the propane stove, and spent the rest of the day reading and sitting by the fire. The warmth made the cabin feel almost cozy for a while. The second night, I went to bed around 9 p.m. The fire had died down, but I left a small lantern burning near the table. Sometime during the night, I woke up to a sound. It was faint, like something brushing against the floor. I lay still, listening. The wind outside had quieted, which made every small sound inside more noticeable. There it was again. A slow scrape, maybe from a branch against the wall or something shifting on the floorboards. I held my breath for a few seconds, trying to pinpoint where it came from. After a while, it stopped. I could hear only the faint hiss of cooling wood in the stove. Eventually, I fell asleep again, though my body stayed tense for the rest of the night. When I woke up in the morning, the fire was completely dead. The air was icy. I sat up and noticed something that didn't make sense. The lantern that I'd left burning was now on the other side of the table. I remembered setting it near the window, but it was now closer to the stove. I wondered if I might have moved it half asleep when I got up during the night, but I didn't remember getting up. I stared at it for a long minute, feeling a small unease rise in my stomach. The day passed slowly. I tried to shake off the feeling that something was wrong. I shoveled snow away from the door, chopped a few more logs, and spent the afternoon writing in my notebook. Around sunset, the wind started picking up again. The weather report before I came up had mentioned a snowstorm moving through, but I didn't expect it to hit so soon. By the time darkness fell, snow was whipping hard against the windows, and the trees outside were bending under the wind. The storm raged all night. I could feel the cold seeping through the walls. I woke up several times just to make sure the fire was still burning. At one point, I thought I heard something hit the wall outside, like a thump followed by the crunch of snow. I figured it was just a branch falling. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was moving around out there. When morning came, the storm had stopped, leaving everything buried in snow. I opened the door to look outside and saw fresh footprints leading from the edge of the woods straight toward the cabin. My stomach dropped. They weren't mine. I hadn't gone outside since before the storm. The tracks were uneven, like whoever made them had stumbled through the deep snow. They stopped right in front of the steps and turned back toward the woods. I stood there for a long time staring at them. The prints looked recent, maybe from early morning. I felt an uncomfortable heat rush through me despite the cold. I checked around the cabin, looking for anything missing or disturbed. Everything seemed in place except for one thing. The small pile of firewood I'd stacked near the door had been rearranged. Some logs were missing, and others were placed differently than I remembered. It was like someone had taken what they needed and tried to make it look the same again. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus. I kept glancing at the door, listening for any sound. The snow made everything quieter, which somehow made it worse. Every creak in the wood made me jump. I tried to reason through it. Maybe a hunter passing by, maybe someone lost in the storm looking for shelter. But if that were the case, why not knock? Why leave before morning? That night, I barricaded the door with a chair and my cooler. I felt stupid doing it, but it gave me a bit of comfort. The wind had died completely, and the silence outside was thick. I sat near the stove reading until my eyes grew heavy. I remember blowing out the lantern and lying down, the glow from the fire fading to a deep orange. I must have fallen asleep quickly because the next thing I knew, I was awake again, lying in the dark. The fire was low, and I could hear something faint, soft, deliberate steps on the wooden floor. I didn't move. My heart started beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. The steps stopped somewhere near the table. Then there was a quiet scraping sound, metal against wood, like someone sliding the lantern. I stayed still, barely breathing. I could feel the cold air shifting in the room as if the door had opened briefly. Then nothing, just silence. I waited what felt like hours before daring to move. The fire had gone out completely, and the air was freezing. I turned on my flashlight and scanned the cabin. Nothing. The door was still shut, the chair still braced against it. But when I looked closer, I noticed the latch was unhooked. I knew I had locked it before bed. I barely slept the rest of the night. In the morning, I checked the door again. The snow outside was disturbed, fresh prints leading away from the cabin. I followed them for a short distance until they disappeared into the woods. The prints were larger than mine, maybe from heavy boots. I turned back quickly, feeling the weight of the empty forest pressing on me. I decided I wasn't staying another night. The storm had cleared, and the road, though still covered in snow, was probably passable if I drove slow. I started packing everything up, stuffing gear into my duffel and dousing the fire. That's when I noticed another small thing. My hatchet, which I kept stuck in the chopping block outside, was missing. The snow around it was disturbed, and there were boot prints circling the area. That sealed it for me. I loaded the truck as fast as I could, trying not to think about who had been out there and why they'd taken it. I turned the key, and the engine groaned before catching. Relief washed through me when it started. I drove out slowly, following my own tire tracks back down the long road. About a mile down, something caught my eye in the side mirror. A dark shape near the tree line where the road curved. It was hard to tell through the snow glare, but it looked like a person standing still, facing the road. I didn't stop. I didn't even look back again. I just kept driving until I reached the main road hours later. When I finally got home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I replayed every detail, the footprints, the moved lantern, the missing hatchet. I sent a message to the cabin's owner the next day, explaining what happened. They said no one else should have been anywhere near that area and that the key I used was the only one. They seemed surprised but didn't offer much help beyond an apology and a refund. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep properly. Every sound in my apartment made me tense. Sometimes I'd wake up thinking I heard footsteps, the same slow, careful ones from the cabin. Eventually it faded, but the memory stuck. The quiet of the woods, the feeling of being watched through the thin cabin walls, and the knowledge that someone had been inside. moving around while I slept. The most disturbing part came later. About a month after I got home, I saw a local news story online about a missing hiker found dead near that same area. They said he'd likely died sometime during the storm, a few miles from the main road. They showed a photo of some of the items recovered, a small hatchet among them. I stared at it for a long time. It looked exactly like mine. I don't know if it was him who came to the cabin, or if someone else had been out there that night. Maybe he was alive then, looking for shelter, too confused or scared to knock. Maybe he came in quietly, took what he needed, and left again before morning. Or maybe it was someone else entirely. I'll never know for sure, but every winter since then, whenever I hear wind pushing against my windows, I think about that night. The soft scrape of footsteps on the wooden floor, the shifting cold air, and the feeling of waking up in the dark knowing I wasn't alone. Weather conditions, routines, and psychological build-up into 15,000 plus words. Asterisk. I rented the cabin because I wanted silence. I had been living in the city for too long, with noise in every corner, and I thought a week in the mountains would help me think clearly again. I found the place online. The photos showed an old wooden cabin surrounded by tall pine trees, miles from the nearest town. It looked quiet, almost too quiet, but that was what I wanted. The owner said it had running water, a small kitchen, and a generator for power. That was enough for me. I packed light, just some clothes, food, a few notebooks, and my laptop. The drive there took most of the afternoon. The road climbed higher and higher, winding through thick forest. The last few miles were rough gravel. My car jolted and rattled as I went deeper into the woods. When I finally reached the cabin, the sun was already low behind the trees. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. There was no other house or sound anywhere, just the creaking of trees and distant birds. The cabin looked even older than in the pictures. The wood was gray and weathered, the windows small and fogged. There was a short porch with a rocking chair and a stack of firewood leaning against one wall. Inside, it was simple but decent. One bedroom, a small living area with a fireplace, and a kitchen with an old gas stove. There was no phone signal. The generator was in a shed out back, and it started after a few pulls of the cord. That first night, I made myself something to eat and sat by the fire for a while. The wind outside had a hollow sound as it moved through the trees, and I remember feeling very small sitting there alone. When I went to bed, I locked the door and the single window in the bedroom. I slept well, though I woke once in the night to what sounded like branches snapping outside. I told myself it was just animals. The next morning was cold and bright. The air was so clear that every sound seemed sharper than usual. I made coffee and went for a walk around the area. The forest floor was soft with pine needles, and there was a small stream about 50 yards from the cabin. I followed it for a while, noticing boot prints in the damp soil near the bank. I thought they might be mine from the day before, but they looked older, and they led away deeper into the trees. I didn't think much of it at the time. When I came back to the cabin later that morning, I noticed the front door wasn't shut all the way. It was just slightly open. I thought maybe I hadn't pulled it tight before leaving. Inside, everything looked the same. Nothing seemed moved or touched. Still, it gave me a strange feeling. I checked all the windows again, made sure they were latched, and told myself to be more careful next time. I spent most of that day writing and reading. The silence made it easy to focus. In the afternoon, clouds started rolling in, and by evening it was raining hard. I sat by the fire again, listening to the rain hit the roof. Sometime later, I heard a sound behind the cabin. Something soft, like a footstep in wet grass. I froze for a moment, then told myself it was probably a deer. The woods were full of them. But the sound came again, a faint shuffle followed by the creak of the porch. I turned off the lantern and sat still, listening. For several minutes, I heard nothing but the rain. Eventually, I convinced myself it was just the wind moving something loose outside. The next morning, I went to check around the cabin. The ground was wet and muddy. On the far side near the porch steps, I saw what looked like a footprint. It wasn't clear, but it was definitely a shoe print, not an animal track. I stared at it for a while, trying to think of a reason why it would be there. The nearest house was miles away. Maybe the owner had come by to check on something, though I hadn't heard a car. That day, I decided to take a longer hike to clear my head. I followed a rough trail uphill, climbing for nearly an hour until I reached a small clearing. From there, I could see the valley below and the thick forest stretching out in every direction. When I finally returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, I noticed something that made me stop cold. The door was closed this time, but the rug in front of it was slightly crooked. I remembered it being straight when I left. Inside, the kitchen window was open a few inches. I was sure I had closed all of them that morning. The rest of the cabin looked normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. My bag was moved slightly away from the wall, one of my notebooks was turned a different way on the table, and a spoon from the counter was on the floor. It wasn't much, but enough to make my skin crawl. I checked every room, even the closet and under the bed, but found nothing. That night, I couldn't relax. I left the fire burning low and kept the lantern on. I sat in the chair facing the door for hours, listening for any noise. Around midnight, I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the side of the cabin. It stopped and started again, irregular and slow. I waited, heart pounding, but eventually it faded away. I barely slept that night. In the morning, I told myself I was being paranoid. Maybe a branch had been brushing against the wall in the wind. Maybe I really had left that window open. Still, I couldn't ignore the uneasiness I felt. I decided to check the area more carefully. Behind the cabin, near the trees, I found several cigarette butts pressed into the dirt. I don't smoke. They looked fairly recent. That was when I knew for sure someone had been around. For the rest of that day, I felt watched. Every time I stepped outside, I scanned the tree line, expecting to see someone standing there. The forest was silent, but not in a peaceful way. It felt like it was holding its breath. I thought about packing up and leaving, but it was late in the day and I didn't want to drive that mountain road in the dark. I decided to stay one more night and leave early the next morning. Before sunset, I checked every lock, closed every window, and dragged one of the chairs in front of the door. I even set a small pot on top of it so I would hear it fall if the door opened. I turned off the lights and stayed in the dark, sitting on the floor near the fireplace. I could hear the faint ticking of the cooling stove and my own breathing. It must have been around midnight when I heard it. A slow, careful step on the porch. Then another. The wood creaked slightly under weight. I didn't move. The sound stopped right outside the door. I could see the faint outline of it in the dim light from the dying fire. For a long time, there was nothing but silence. Then the door handle turned slowly, just once, then again, harder this time, but the lock held. I felt my entire body go rigid. Whoever it was stood there for what felt like forever. Then I heard the sound of retreating steps fading into the forest. I didn't sleep at all after that. As soon as dawn came, I packed everything as fast as I could. When I went outside, I saw fresh footprints in the damp earth leading from the porch toward the woods. They were large, deep prints made by heavy boots. They led only one way away. But as I turned toward my car, I saw something that made me stop. My car doors were open, both of them. I was sure I had locked them when I arrived. Inside, the glove compartment was open and the seat was pushed back farther than I left it. I felt sick. Someone had been going through my things, maybe waiting for me to come out. I didn't care about anything else. I got in, started the engine, and drove away fast down that gravel road, glancing at the mirror every few seconds. I didn't see anyone behind me. I didn't stop until I reached the main highway. I kept driving until I reached a gas station miles away. When I finally looked at my phone, I had a signal again. There was nothing strange on it, no missed calls or messages. But when I opened the trunk later that day, I realized something that chilled me. The food box I kept there was half empty. Someone had taken some of the cans and snacks. Whoever had been around that cabin hadn't just been watching. They'd been living nearby, probably coming in when I was gone. I thought about the cigarette butts, the footprints, the moved items, the open car. It all added up in a way I hadn't wanted to see. I must have interrupted whoever was using that cabin as shelter. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone hiding out, maybe something worse. Weeks later, back in the city, I looked up the area online again. I found a local news article from the previous year. It said a man had been reported missing in those woods, someone who'd been squatting in abandoned cabins and stealing food from campsites. They never found him. I never went back to the mountains after that. The thought of that door handle turning in the dark still wakes me up sometimes. I can still hear the creak of the porch, the quiet steps in the rain, and I always wonder if that man was out there, watching me from the trees the whole time, waiting for me to leave so he could come back inside and sleep where I had been. I booked the cabin because I wanted quiet. I had been working non-stop for months, barely sleeping, spending most of my days inside a small apartment full of noise and light from the city. I felt like I needed to disappear for a while. The listing showed a small wooden cabin deep inside a forest near the base of a mountain. It was supposed to be peaceful, isolated, with no one nearby for miles. That idea felt perfect to me. I wanted to be completely alone, where I could hear nothing but wind and trees. I didn't think much about how isolation can also become something heavy, something that presses down on you once you realize there's no one around to help if something goes wrong. I drove there on a Friday morning in late October. The road got smaller the farther I went, turning from smooth asphalt into a cracked single lane, then into a dirt path full of rocks and mud. The GPS stopped working long before I reached the cabin. By the time I parked my car, there was no signal at all. It didn't bother me at first. I felt relieved not to have my phone buzzing every few minutes. I carried 2 large bags from the car, one for clothes, one for food and basic supplies, and started walking toward the cabin. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. The air smelled like cold earth and wet leaves. The cabin was old but looked solid, built with thick logs darkened by age. The roof was covered with moss, and the porch was uneven but strong enough to hold my weight when I stepped on it. Inside, it smelled faintly like wood smoke and dust. The main room had a small wood stove, a table, 1 chair, and a bed against the far wall. There was also a narrow kitchen area with a sink that connected to a water tank outside. The bathroom was small and simple, with cold water only. I unpacked slowly, arranging my things neatly. I always like keeping order, especially in unfamiliar places. I checked every corner, every window, making sure the locks worked. Everything seemed fine except one thing: the door had an old-style latch on the inside, the kind you could lift easily. There was no real lock from the outside. It meant if someone came while I was away, they could walk in without much effort. I told myself it didn't matter. No one was out here anyway. The first night was calm. I made a small fire in the stove, cooked pasta, and sat by the window watching the woods turn darker until the glass reflected only the inside of the cabin. The silence was thick, the kind of silence that makes your ears ring. I went to bed early, with only the faint orange glow of the fire lighting the room. I woke once in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, and I remember standing still afterward because I thought I heard something outside. It was faint, like the sound of a footstep on wet ground. Then it stopped. I waited, listening hard, but all I could hear was the wind moving through the trees. I told myself it was just an animal and went back to bed. The next morning, when I went to make coffee, I noticed something strange. The small knife I had left beside the sink was on the table. I didn't remember moving it. I thought maybe I had, without realizing it. I brushed it off. Later that day, I went hiking along a narrow trail behind the cabin. It led up through the trees to a small ridge where I could see the valley below. I spent a few hours there and returned before sunset. When I stepped inside the cabin, I froze. The chair at the table was pulled out slightly, as if someone had just been sitting there. My first thought was that I must have left it that way, but I remembered clearly pushing it in that morning. My heart started to race. I checked the door, the windows, even looked under the bed like a child. Everything was empty and quiet. I walked outside and circled the cabin, looking for footprints or any sign of someone nearby. The ground was damp from morning dew, but there were no clear tracks except mine. Still, I felt uneasy for the rest of the evening. That night, I couldn't sleep deeply. Every little noise made me open my eyes. The crack of wood in the stove, the rustle of wind against the walls, the faint creak of the porch boards. Around midnight, I heard something that made me sit up. It was a slow sound, like soft steps moving across the porch. I held my breath and stared at the door. The steps stopped after a few seconds. I waited, not moving, barely breathing. Nothing happened. I finally forced myself to get up quietly and check the latch. It was still down, still locked from the inside. I didn't see any shadow or movement through the small window next to the door. After several minutes, I went back to bed, but I didn't close my eyes for a long time. The next morning, I saw that one of the firewood pieces I had stacked neatly by the porch had been knocked over. A few logs lay scattered a few feet away, half buried in dirt. Maybe an animal had done it, I thought. But the way they were placed didn't look like something random. It looked like someone had moved them deliberately. I felt tense all day. I tried reading, walking, cooking, anything to keep my mind busy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every time I stepped outside, I looked toward the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching. There was never anyone. That evening, it rained hard. The sound of it hitting the roof was loud, steady, like a constant low roar. I stayed inside by the stove, drinking tea and staring at the fire. I told myself again that I was imagining things, that I was too tired and too jumpy. When I went to bed, I felt slightly calmer. The rain muffled all other sounds, and the warmth from the stove made the room comfortable. I fell asleep faster than I had the previous nights. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I noticed was that the rain had stopped. The second thing was that the front door was open, only slightly, just an inch or two, enough to let cold air drift in. I stared at it for a full minute before moving. My hands felt numb as I walked toward it. The latch was still down, but bent slightly, as if someone had forced it from outside. I went outside immediately, checking around the porch and the clearing. The ground was muddy from the rain, and there were footprints, several of them, leading from the trees to the porch. They were faint in some spots but clear enough in others to see the shape of a boot. They weren't mine. I followed them a few feet into the trees, but they disappeared into the wet leaves and pine needles. I stood there, turning in circles, trying to listen for any sound. There was nothing. I spent the rest of that day in constant fear. Every sound made me flinch. I locked the door with a rope and a chair wedged under the handle, though I knew it wouldn't stop someone determined to get in. I considered leaving, but it was already late in the afternoon, and the drive back through the dirt road would be dangerous in the fading light. I told myself I'd leave first thing in the morning. That night, I couldn't sleep deeply. Every little noise made me open my eyes. The crack of wood in the stove, the rustle of wind against the walls, the faint creak of the porch boards. Around midnight, I heard something that made me sit up. It was a slow sound, like soft steps moving across the porch. I held my breath and stared at the door. The steps stopped after a few seconds. I waited, not moving, barely breathing. Nothing happened. I finally forced myself to get up quietly and check the latch. It was still down, still locked from the inside. I didn't see any shadow or movement through the small window next to the door. After several minutes, I went back to bed, but I didn't close my eyes for a long time. The next morning, I saw that one of the firewood pieces I had stacked neatly by the porch had been knocked over. A few logs lay scattered a few feet away, half buried in dirt. Maybe an animal had done it, I thought. But the way they were placed didn't look like something random. It looked like someone had moved them deliberately. I felt tense all day. I tried reading, walking, cooking, anything to keep my mind busy, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every time I stepped outside, I looked toward the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching. There was never anyone. That evening, it rained hard. The sound of it hitting the roof was loud, steady, like a constant low roar. I stayed inside by the stove, drinking tea and staring at the fire. I told myself again that I was imagining things, that I was too tired and too jumpy. When I went to bed, I felt slightly calmer. The rain muffled all other sounds, and the warmth from the stove made the room comfortable. I fell asleep faster than I had the previous nights. When I woke up the next morning, the first thing I noticed was that the rain had stopped. The second thing was that the front door was open, only slightly, just an inch or two, enough to let cold air drift in. I stared at it for a full minute before moving. My hands felt numb as I walked toward it. The latch was still down, but bent slightly, as if someone had forced it from outside. I went outside immediately, checking around the porch and the clearing. The ground was muddy from the rain, and there were footprints, several of them, leading from the trees to the porch. They were faint in some spots, but clear enough in others to see the shape of a boot. They weren't mine. I followed them a few feet into the trees, but they disappeared into the wet leaves and pine needles. I stood there, turning in circles, trying to listen for any sound. There was nothing. I spent the rest of that day in constant fear. Every sound made me flinch. I locked the door with a rope and a chair wedged under the handle, though I knew it wouldn't stop someone determined to get in. I considered leaving, but it was already late in the afternoon, and the drive back through the dirt road would be dangerous in the fading light. I told myself I'd leave first thing in the morning. That night was the longest of my life. I didn't sleep. I sat by the stove with a flashlight in my lap, staring at the door. Hours passed in silence. Sometime around 3 a.m., I heard it again, the faint creak of the porch boards. Then the sound of the door handle moving slightly, just a soft metal click. I froze, not breathing. The handle moved again, a little harder this time, then stopped. After that, only silence. I sat there for what felt like an hour before I dared to move. I waited until I saw the faint gray light of dawn before I finally stood up and opened the door. The porch was empty. The ground outside was covered in a new layer of mud from the rain, and there were fresh footprints again. They came right up to the door, turned slightly, and went back toward the trees. I packed everything as quickly as I could. I didn't even eat breakfast. I loaded my bags into the car, got inside, and started the engine. The moment I pulled away, I felt a mix of relief and panic. The forest seemed endless as I drove out, the trees thick and close to the road. Every time I turned a corner, I expected to see someone standing there. When I finally reached the main road and saw a few distant houses, I almost laughed from relief. But as I drove, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. The footprints, the door, the knife, the chair, all of it pointed to someone being there. I started wondering if maybe someone had been using that cabin before I rented it, maybe living in the woods nearby and coming in when they thought it was empty. Maybe I had disrupted their space, and they were just watching, waiting for me to leave. That thought unsettled me more than anything else. When I got home later that day, I called the company I had rented the cabin from. I told them what happened. They said they'd send someone to check. A few days later, they emailed me saying the property manager had gone out there and found signs that someone had been living nearby. A small makeshift shelter made from tarps and wood a few hundred meters from the cabin. It had clothes, food wrappers, and tools inside. Whoever it was had been there for a while. They didn't find the person, though. Just the empty shelter and more footprints leading deeper into the forest. After hearing that, I couldn't stop replaying everything in my head. The moved chair, the knife, the door opening. Whoever it was had been close, watching me every night, waiting for me to sleep. They must have come inside more than once. Maybe they even stood by the bed while I was asleep. The thought of it still makes my chest tighten. I had been alone in that cabin, but not really. Someone had been sharing the space with me, just quietly enough that I didn't know until the last few days. Even now, months later, I think about that place sometimes. I imagine that person still out there, moving through the trees, waiting for the next person to rent the cabin. I never went back, and I never will. When I think of isolation now, I don't picture peace or quiet. I picture that door slowly creaking open in the dark, and the feeling that something was just on the other side of it, standing still, listening. I had been looking for a quiet place to get away for a few days, somewhere far from my phone, work, and the noise of the city. I found a small cabin listed for rent deep in a forested area near the edge of a state park. The photos showed a small wooden structure surrounded by tall pine trees, with a lake only a few hundred yards away. The listing said there was no cell service and no nearby houses for miles. That sounded perfect to me. I drove there in early autumn, when the air still held warmth but the trees were starting to turn orange and brown. The road narrowed the deeper I went, turning from asphalt to cracked gravel and finally to dirt. For the last few miles, the forest closed in so tightly that sunlight barely touched the road. My car bounced over rocks and small holes until I finally saw the small wooden sign pointing toward the cabin. When I arrived, I parked on a patch of dirt covered in dry pine needles. The cabin looked older than in the photos. The paint on the window frames had peeled away, and the steps to the porch sagged slightly. Still, it felt solid. It sat on a slight hill with tall trees behind it and an open slope leading down toward the lake. The air smelled like pine and damp soil. The only sounds were the rustle of leaves and the distant call of birds. Inside, the cabin was simple: one large room with a bed, a small kitchen area, and a wood stove. The walls were made of dark timber, rough but clean. There was no electricity except for a small generator outside, which the owner said I should only use for short periods to charge devices or power the single light bulb. The water came from a hand pump outside. It was basic, but that's what I wanted. I unpacked my things: a backpack of clothes, some canned food, a flashlight, a small knife, a lantern, and a sleeping bag just in case the bed felt too musty. After checking around, I found the back door open to a short trail that led straight to the lake. I walked down there and saw calm water stretching out like a mirror. The forest reflected on it so clearly it almost looked fake. The first day went quietly. I made a small fire outside, cooked some beans, and watched the sun go down. The sky turned orange, then purple, then black. When darkness came, it was deeper than I expected. The woods around the cabin swallowed all light. I could barely see past the edge of the porch. I had no cell service, so there was no way to scroll or check anything. I just sat there, listening. I didn't realize until then how much noise silence could have. Small branches cracking, something moving through the leaves, wind shifting through the trees. That night, I slept lightly. Every creak of the wood, every sound outside made me open my eyes. Around midnight, I heard what sounded like something brushing against the cabin wall. I stayed still, breathing quietly, listening. It stopped after a few seconds. Maybe an animal, I thought. I forced myself to relax and eventually drifted off again. The next morning, I went outside to look around. The air was cold and damp, the kind that sticks to your clothes. I walked around the cabin and saw faint marks in the dirt near one of the windows. Not footprints exactly, but the kind of indentations that could have come from a boot or a heavy paw. I crouched down to look closer, but the dirt was too uneven to tell. Probably just a raccoon or something. I decided to take a walk along the tree line. The forest looked beautiful in the morning light, quiet but alive. I followed a small trail that seemed to wind deeper in, just to explore a bit. After about 15 minutes, I came across an old structure. A small shed, half collapsed and covered in moss. Its roof had caved in on one side, and the door was missing. Inside were some rusty tools, an old oil can, and a broken chair. It looked abandoned for decades. I didn't stay long. Something about the smell, damp, metallic, faintly sour, made me step back out quickly. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something strange. The back door, which I was sure I had closed, was slightly open. Not wide, just enough that the wind could have pushed it. But I didn't remember leaving it unlocked. I looked around inside. Nothing seemed touched. My backpack was still by the bed, and my food was still on the counter. Maybe I just hadn't latched it properly. I spent the rest of the day chopping some small logs and sitting by the lake. The stillness started to feel heavy after a while. The forest seemed too quiet sometimes, like the air itself was holding its breath. I would catch myself turning towards small sounds, twigs snapping, faint rustling, and then standing there, waiting, only to hear nothing more. When night came again, I decided to keep the lantern burning for a while. I sat on the bed, writing in a small notebook I'd brought, just to pass time. Around 11 p.m., I turned the lantern off and lay down. I didn't fall asleep right away. I listened to the wind pressing softly against the windows, and then a sudden sound made my body go tense. Something like slow, deliberate footsteps on the porch. They were light, but I could hear them clearly through the wooden floor. Step, pause, step. Then nothing. My chest tightened. I stayed still, my hand slowly reaching for the flashlight beside me. I waited, barely breathing. The sound didn't come back. I turned the flashlight on and aimed it at the door. Nothing. I got up quietly and walked to the window. When I shined the beam outside, it caught the edges of the trees and the glint of the metal hand pump. Nothing moved. I didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I went outside again. The porch had a layer of dust and dry needles. In that thin layer, I saw marks. Faint, uneven, but definitely shaped like the front of boots. Someone or something heavy had stepped there. They led from the steps toward the corner of the cabin and then stopped near the wall. The space beneath the porch was too dark to see clearly, but I crouched down anyway, shining the flashlight there. Just dirt and a few rocks. No animal. I told myself again that maybe it had been a hiker passing through, maybe lost. The marks could have been old. The forest was public land, after all. But that didn't sit right with me. I hadn't seen or heard anyone since arriving, and the nearest town was at least 30 minutes away by car. Later that day, I went back toward the old shed I'd found. I don't know why, maybe just to make sure I hadn't imagined it. When I got there, I noticed something I hadn't before. Behind the shed, there was a narrow path leading downhill, hidden between two thick trees. It was barely wide enough to walk through. I followed it slowly, pushing branches aside. After about 50 yards, the path opened into a small clearing. There was something there. An old metal drum, half buried, rusted through. Around it, the ground was uneven, like it had been dug up and filled again years ago. There were pieces of wood and scraps of plastic scattered around. I stood there, not sure why it made me uneasy. It just didn't fit with the rest of the forest. I turned around and went back to the cabin, but that clearing stayed in my mind all afternoon. Something about it felt wrong, as if it had been used for something not meant to be found. That night, the noises started again. It was close to midnight when I woke to a soft sound. Scraping, like wood being dragged over dirt. It was coming from behind the cabin. My heart started to pound. I lay perfectly still, listening. The sound came again, slow, irregular. Then a thud. I got up quietly, grabbed the flashlight, and went to the window facing the back. I waited a few seconds before shining the light out. The beam caught the trees, the ground, and the small area behind the cabin. Nothing. I turned the light toward the pump. Still nothing. But then, near the base of the trees, I saw something pale. I aimed the light fully at it and saw a small bundle, like a piece of fabric or a plastic bag. I went outside slowly, stepping carefully on the wooden porch to avoid noise. The cold air hit my face, and the silence felt sharp. When I got close to the object, I saw it was a torn piece of cloth, maybe from a jacket. It was damp and muddy. I picked it up and noticed dry, dark stains on it. Could have been old dirt or something else. When I went back inside, I locked the door and placed a chair against it. I stayed awake until dawn, waiting for more sounds, but nothing came. By the next morning, I knew I needed to leave. Something didn't feel right anymore. I started packing my bag, but before I finished, I decided to walk to the clearing one more time. I don't even know why. Curiosity or fear, maybe both. I took the flashlight and the small knife just in case. When I reached the clearing, the first thing I noticed was that the metal drum had been moved. It was tilted on its side, and the ground beneath it looked freshly disturbed. The soil was loose and darker than before. I froze, staring at it. Someone had been here, maybe last night. I backed away slowly, scanning the trees. I felt eyes on me, though I saw no one. Every sound, the wind, the leaves shifting, felt amplified. I turned and started walking back, faster this time, almost jogging. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door and pulled the curtains shut. Then I noticed something else. My backpack, the one I had left by the bed, was moved. It wasn't much, just a few inches from where I left it, but I knew it had been untouched before. I checked inside. Nothing was missing, but one of the side pockets was unzipped. I hadn't left it like that. That was the final sign for me. I started the car engine as fast as I could and left the generator, the food, everything behind. The dirt road was rough, but I didn't care about the bumps. I just wanted to reach the main road. I didn't look back at the cabin, not once. When I finally reached the highway, I pulled over and sat for a while, shaking. I couldn't explain exactly what had happened, only that I'd felt watched. Not by something supernatural, but by someone real. A few days later, I read an article online about illegal hunting camps and missing person cases near that area. It mentioned old cabins sometimes used as temporary shelters. They found one a few miles from where I'd stayed, with signs that someone had been living there, food cans, clothing, and tools. I never went back to see if it was the same one. But even now, when I close my eyes, I can still picture that metal drum half buried in the dirt and the fresh soil beneath it, like someone had just finished digging before I arrived. I rented the cabin because I needed quiet. I had been living in the city for too long, surrounded by traffic, constant phone calls, and the feeling that I couldn't hear myself think. I wanted somewhere still, somewhere where I could wake up, make coffee, and write without being interrupted by noise or people. I found the listing for the cabin on a small rental site that mostly posted rural properties. It was described as an isolated forest retreat about 2 hours from the nearest town, near a stream called Miller Creek. The pictures showed a small, weathered wooden structure with a metal roof, sitting in a clearing surrounded by pine trees. It looked plain and quiet, exactly what I wanted. The owner's message said there was no cell signal, but that the cabin had a small generator, propane stove, and a hand pump for water. That didn't bother me. I wanted to be disconnected. I brought a week's worth of food, a few notebooks, a lantern, and a couple of jugs of fuel for the generator. I drove up there in my old SUV on a Monday afternoon in late October. The last half hour of the drive was on a dirt road that kept getting narrower, the trees pressing in closer on both sides. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was already low, and the woods were thick and quiet. The cabin was smaller than I expected. Just one main room with a small kitchenette and a single bed against the wall. There was a small table near the window, a wood stove in the corner, and a narrow door that led to a small bathroom. The smell inside was old wood, a bit of dampness, and faint smoke from the stove that had probably been used recently. I unpacked, filled the lantern with fuel, and walked around the place to get a feel for it. There was a small shed behind the cabin with a few tools, a rusted axe, and a pile of chopped firewood stacked under a tarp. Behind that, the forest sloped down toward the creek, which I could hear but not see clearly through the trees. That first night was quiet. After I cooked some soup on the small propane stove, I sat by the table with a notebook, trying to outline a few chapters for the project I was working on. I felt peaceful for the first time in months. The only sounds were the slow hum of the generator outside and the wind pushing gently through the trees. When I went to bed, I left the lantern dimmed low on the table. I woke up once around 2 a.m. because of a sound outside, a kind of rustle, like someone stepping on dry leaves near the window. I listened for a while, thinking maybe it was an animal. After a minute or two, it stopped, and I went back to sleep. The next morning, I walked down toward the creek. The air was cold and smelled like pine and wet earth. I followed a faint path that led from behind the shed through the trees. The creek was about 50 yards downhill, narrow but moving fast over rocks with frost collecting along its edges. There were no other cabins or houses in sight. The forest stretched endlessly in every direction, dense and quiet. It gave me a strange feeling, being completely alone like that, peaceful but also too quiet. When I came back up, I noticed something odd near the side of the cabin, a footprint in the damp soil. It looked human. It wasn't mine. It was smaller, maybe from a boot or work shoe, and it seemed fresh. I crouched and looked closely at it, but the ground around it was covered with pine needles, so I couldn't see any trail leading away. I told myself maybe it was from the owner, maybe he had been there recently to check the generator or drop something off. It didn't seem like a big deal. That day I wrote for several hours, made coffee on the small stove, and read for a while in the afternoon. Around dusk, I went outside to start the generator again, since it shut off automatically after a few hours. I kept it near the back wall of the cabin, under a small cover of sheet metal. When I reached it, I saw that one of the fuel jugs I had left there was half empty. I was sure it had been full the day before. I told myself maybe I just misjudged it. I refilled the generator, came back inside, and shut the door. That night, around midnight, I heard footsteps again. Slow, heavy ones this time. They seemed to move from behind the cabin toward the side window. I stayed still in bed, my eyes open in the dark. The sound stopped for a while, then I heard it again near the porch, 2 dull thuds, then silence. I sat up and grabbed my flashlight. I didn't go outside. I waited maybe 20 minutes, listening. Eventually, I heard a distant crack of a branch deeper in the woods, and then nothing else. I barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning, I looked around outside. I found more footprints near the shed. They weren't mine. They circled behind the cabin and then disappeared toward the trees. I also noticed the latch on the shed door was open, even though I remembered closing it tightly before. Inside, everything looked the same, except the axe that had been leaning against the wall was now missing. I searched around but didn't see it anywhere. I started feeling uneasy. I kept telling myself there was probably a simple explanation. Maybe the owner had someone maintaining the place. But there had been no mention of that. The rental post said it was completely private. For the rest of that day, I stayed inside more than usual. I tried to write, but I couldn't focus. I kept listening for sounds outside. The wind was picking up, and I could hear the trees groaning softly. Around late afternoon, I noticed something else strange. The curtain on the small back window had been moved. It wasn't just hanging differently. It looked like someone had pushed it aside and then let it fall back. I hadn't touched it. I checked the latch on the window. It was still locked, but I couldn't stop thinking about the possibility that someone had been looking in. By nightfall, I was nervous enough that I took one of the heavy chairs and wedged it under the front door handle. The generator was off, and I decided not to turn it back on. I wanted silence. The cabin was completely dark except for the dim lantern by my bed. Every small creak or gust of wind made me alert. At some point, maybe around 11 p.m., I heard it again. Slow movement outside. Then a faint metallic sound like something being dragged. I froze. I didn't move or breathe for what felt like several minutes. The sound stopped, then started again, closer this time. I picked up the flashlight and quietly stepped to the small window beside the bed. I turned off the lantern so I could see outside better. The forest was dark, only a sliver of moonlight cutting through the trees. I thought I saw something near the shed. A faint outline, maybe a person, but I couldn't tell. I waited until I was sure it wasn't just shadows moving. Then I saw it again. Someone walking behind the shed. They moved slowly, almost cautiously, like they knew I might be watching. I felt my stomach tighten. I stayed up until almost morning, sitting near the window, flashlight in hand, trying to convince myself it was just a hunter passing through or someone camping nearby. But I knew that made no sense. There were no trails, no roads, and no other cabins around. When it was light enough, I went outside. I walked slowly around the cabin, checking the ground. There were prints again, same as before, small boot prints, clear in the damp soil. I followed them as far as I could. They led past the shed, down toward the creek. Near the edge of the woods, I saw something that made me stop. There was an old blue tarp stretched between 2 trees, maybe 30 yards from the water. Under it were some blankets, a small metal pot, and a few food wrappers. It looked like someone had been camping there. The ground around it was packed down. I saw what looked like a small path from that spot leading up toward my cabin. My heart was beating fast as I stood there. Someone had been living right behind the place. I went back up, locked the door, and sat down at the table trying to think. There was no phone signal, no way to contact anyone. The road to town was miles of dirt, and I didn't even know if I'd find help there. I told myself maybe I could leave first thing in the morning after sunrise. I pack everything, start the car, and go. I felt calmer thinking that way, but the rest of the day crawled by. Every sound outside made me jump. Once I thought I heard something tapping against the wall near the kitchen window, But when I checked, there was nothing. When night came, I didn't light the lantern. I didn't want whoever was out there to see where I was. I sat in the dark for a long time, listening. Around midnight, I heard soft movement again. This time it wasn't just near the shed. It was around the porch. I heard the boards creak slowly, one step at a time. Then silence. I gripped the flashlight so hard my hand hurt. I waited, but nothing happened for a few minutes. Then I heard the faint scrape of metal, the sound of the front door handle turning. The chair I had wedged underneath shifted slightly. I froze completely. Whoever it was must have realized it was blocked because I heard them step back. Then another sound, something brushing against the wall, moving toward the window. I didn't dare move. I kept the flashlight off and stayed completely still, trying not to breathe too loud. After maybe 5 minutes, the sounds faded. Then I heard footsteps again, moving away toward the trees. I waited a long time before I let myself move. When morning came, I packed quickly. I barely ate. I loaded my bag, notebooks, and fuel jugs into the SUV. Before leaving, I looked once more toward the woods behind the shed. The tarp was gone. Only the flattened grass and the small pile of wrappers were left. Whoever had been there must have packed up before dawn. I didn't want to think about how close they might have been during the night. I started the SUV, and the sound of the engine breaking the silence felt strange after so many days of quiet. As I drove away, the trees seemed to close behind me again, swallowing the narrow dirt road. About 20 minutes down the road, I came to a small clearing where the trees opened enough for sunlight to spill through. I stopped the SUV and got out to breathe for a minute. I looked back in the direction of the cabin, hidden somewhere deep in those woods. Felt like the silence there was still watching me. When I finally reached the main paved road and saw the first sign of a telephone pole, I felt my chest loosen for the first time in days. That night, I stayed in a small roadside motel on the edge of town. Couldn't sleep much. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that tarp, that empty spot where someone had been living behind me without my knowledge. I kept wondering how long they had been there before I arrived. Maybe weeks, maybe months. The cabin had felt untouched when I got there, but the footprints and the missing axe told another story. Whoever it was must have been using that place long before I came. Maybe they knew the owner never visited. Maybe they thought it was abandoned. The next morning, I drove to the small local police office in town and told them what had happened. I explained about the footprints, the noises, the missing axe, and the makeshift camp behind the cabin. The officer wrote it all down and said they would send someone to check the property. I never went back there. A few weeks later, I got an email from the rental site saying the listing had been removed. No explanation. I didn't ask for one. Even now, months later, I still think about that cabin sometimes. I remember how quiet it was, how peaceful it seemed at first, and how that peace slowly turned into something heavy and wrong. I wonder who was out there watching me, what they wanted, and what would have happened if I had stayed one more night. The memory of that sound, the slow creak of the porch boards and the faint turn of the door handle, still wakes me up sometimes. When I do, I always check my own front door, just to make sure it's locked. I tell myself it's over, that whoever was there is long gone. But sometimes, when the night is quiet and I can hear the wind outside, I think about how easy it would be for someone to just stand in the dark, watching, waiting, just like they did out there beyond Miller Creek. It was early October when I decided to rent a small cabin for a week to get away from everything. I had been working long hours for months, sleeping badly, and spending too much time in front of screens. I wanted somewhere quiet, somewhere with no cell service, no traffic, no people. The idea of being alone in the woods sounded peaceful, and I thought the silence would clear my head. The cabin was listed online as an off-grid rental about 30 miles north of a small mountain town. The photos showed an old wooden structure surrounded by thick pine trees, with a small porch, a creek nearby, and a basic interior: a bed, a table, a wood stove, and a few shelves. It looked simple but clean, and the owner's description mentioned that there was no electricity, only a propane stove for cooking, and a small solar light system that powered a single bulb in the main room. That sounded perfect to me. I arrived on a Monday morning after a 3-hour drive. The last half hour was along a dirt road that twisted through endless forest. My phone lost signal 10 minutes into the drive, and by the time I pulled up to the clearing where the cabin stood, the world was completely silent except for the wind in the trees. There was no one around, no houses, no parked cars, no distant sounds of engines. Just forest, the creek, and the cabin. The place looked even more remote in person than it had in the photos. The wooden walls were dark from age and weather, and the small windows reflected the trees like mirrors. There was a small shed to one side and a half-rotten picnic table in front. The air smelled like pine and cold water. I parked beside the porch, carried my bag inside, and took a slow look around. The interior was basic but tidy. A small bed with clean sheets sat against one wall. A table and 2 chairs faced a narrow window. The wood stove was in the corner with a neat stack of firewood beside it. There was a shelf with cooking pans, matches, and a few candles. Everything looked like someone had taken care to make it simple but livable. I spent the first few hours unpacking and exploring the area around the cabin. The creek ran about 50 yards away, shallow but cold and clear. There were animal tracks near the bank, maybe deer or raccoons. The trees were thick, and the forest floor was covered with dry needles that muffled my footsteps. The silence was so complete it felt heavy, but I liked it. I hadn't realized how constant background noise had become part of my life until it was gone. That first night was peaceful. I lit the wood stove as the temperature dropped, cooked a can of soup on the propane burner, and sat at the table watching the firelight flicker across the walls. The solar light above the table gave off a faint yellow glow, just enough to see. I wrote in a notebook for a while, then turned in early. The silence outside was absolute, broken only by the faint sound of the creek. I slept well. The next morning, I went for a walk along the creek, following it upstream through the trees. I found old signs of a trail, bits of rotted wood that might have been a footbridge, a section where the ground had been cleared long ago. It made me wonder if the area had once been used for logging or if there had been another cabin nearby years ago. When I got back to the cabin around noon, something small but strange caught my attention. The front door was slightly open. I was sure I had closed it before I left. I had even pulled it tight because the latch was a bit loose. I thought maybe the wind had blown it open. The door didn't have a proper lock, just a hook latch inside. I stepped in and checked around. Everything looked normal. My bag on the bed, my notebook on the table, dishes where I left them. I shut the door properly, this time making sure it caught, and told myself not to overthink it. That afternoon I gathered firewood and read by the creek. But the thought of the door being open stuck with me. I told myself I'd probably forgotten to latch it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone might have been there. I looked around the clearing a few times, scanning the tree line. There was nothing, just stillness. That night, I heard something outside just after I lay down. It was faint, like a light crunch in the dry needles near the cabin. I held my breath and listened. There were a few more steps, slow and irregular, then silence again. It could have been an animal, maybe a deer or raccoon, but the steps had seemed careful, almost quieted on purpose. I stayed still for a long time, heart beating fast, staring at the ceiling in the dark. Eventually, I drifted off. The next morning, I stepped outside to look around. There were faint footprints in the dirt path near the porch. Not boots, not bare feet, but something like worn sneakers. The prints were shallow, maybe a day old, leading from the trees toward the cabin, then away again. I felt uneasy seeing them. It was strange because I hadn't seen any signs of other people for miles. I told myself it might have been someone from the property owner's family checking on the place. Maybe they had come by when I was walking the day before. That thought calmed me enough to stay. I spent that day chopping small logs for the stove. Around mid-afternoon, while I was working near the shed, I noticed something else odd. Behind the shed was a small patch of flattened grass and what looked like the remains of a fire pit. A few blackened stones and a bit of ash. It wasn't recent, but it hadn't been washed away by rain either. It meant someone had camped there sometime in the last few weeks. The discovery unsettled me. I started thinking about how remote the cabin really was. Miles from the nearest house, no phone service, no one who would hear if something happened. Still, I stayed. I had paid for the week and didn't want to admit that I was scared. That night I slept badly. I kept hearing sounds outside, not loud, just faint movements that came and went. Once I thought I heard the creak of the porch boards. I told myself it had to be wind or an animal, but my pulse stayed high. I kept the flashlight in my hand most of the night. The next morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. My notebook, which I had left on the table, was gone. I searched the whole cabin before finding it outside on the porch, sitting on the railing as if someone had placed it there. It didn't make sense. I hadn't brought it outside. The pages were slightly damp from dew, and one page near the back was bent, like someone had thumbed through it. I told myself again that maybe it had been a hiker passing through, maybe lost. The marks could have been old. The forest was public land, after all. But that didn't sit right with me. I hadn't seen or heard anyone since arriving, and the nearest town was at least 30 minutes away by car. Later that day, I went back toward the old shed I'd found. I don't know why, maybe just to make sure I hadn't imagined it. When I got there, I noticed something I hadn't before. Behind the shed, there was a narrow path leading downhill, hidden between two thick trees. It was barely wide enough to walk through. I followed it slowly, pushing branches aside. After about 50 yards, the path opened into a small clearing. There was something there. An old metal drum, half buried, rusted through. Around it, the ground was uneven, like it had been dug up and filled again years ago. There were pieces of wood and scraps of plastic scattered around. I stood there, not sure why it made me uneasy. It just didn't fit with the rest of the forest. I turned around and went back to the cabin, but that clearing stayed in my mind all afternoon. Something about it felt wrong, as if it had been used for something not meant to be found. That night, the noises started again. It was close to midnight when I woke to a soft sound. Scraping, like wood being dragged over dirt. It was coming from behind the cabin. My heart started to pound. I lay perfectly still, listening. The sound came again, slow, irregular. Then a thud. I got up quietly, grabbed the flashlight, and went to the window facing the back. I waited a few seconds before shining the light out. The beam caught the trees, the ground, and the small area behind the cabin. Nothing. I turned the light toward the pump. Still nothing. But then, near the base of the trees, I saw something pale. I aimed the light fully at it and saw a small bundle, like a piece of fabric or a plastic bag. I went outside slowly, stepping carefully on the wooden porch to avoid noise. The cold air hit my face, and the silence felt sharp. When I got close to the object, I saw it was a torn piece of cloth, maybe from a jacket. It was damp and muddy. I picked it up and noticed dry, dark stains on it. Could have been old dirt or something else. When I went back inside, I locked the door and placed a chair against it. I stayed awake until dawn, waiting for more sounds, but nothing came. By the next morning, I knew I needed to leave. Something didn't feel right anymore. I started packing my bag, but before I finished, I decided to walk to the clearing one more time. I don't even know why. Curiosity or fear, maybe both. I took the flashlight and the small knife just in case. When I reached the clearing, the first thing I noticed was that the metal drum had been moved. It was tilted on its side, and the ground beneath it looked freshly disturbed. The soil was loose and darker than before. I froze, staring at it. Someone had been here, maybe last night. I backed away slowly, scanning the trees. I felt eyes on me, though I saw no one. Every sound, the wind, the leaves shifting, felt amplified. I turned and started walking back, faster this time, almost jogging. When I reached the cabin, I locked the door and pulled the curtains shut. Then I noticed something else. My backpack, the one I had left by the bed, was moved. It wasn't much, just a few inches from where I left it, but I knew it had been untouched before. I checked inside. Nothing was missing, but one of the side pockets was unzipped. I hadn't left it like that. That was the final sign for me. I started the car engine as fast as I could and left the generator, the food, everything behind. The dirt road was rough, but I didn't care about the bumps. I just wanted to reach the main road. I didn't look back at the cabin, not once. When I finally reached the highway, I pulled over and sat for a while, shaking. I couldn't explain exactly what had happened, only that I'd felt watched. Not by something supernatural, but by someone real. A few days later, I read an article online about illegal hunting camps and missing person cases near that area. It mentioned old cabins sometimes used as temporary shelters. They found one a few miles from where I'd stayed, with signs that someone had been living there, food cans, clothing, and tools. I never went back to see if it was the same one. But even now, when I close my eyes, I can still picture that metal drum half buried in the dirt, and the fresh soil beneath it, like someone had just finished digging before I arrived. I went to the cabin to get away from everything for a few days. It was early October, right before the cold started to really settle in. I had rented the place online, a small wooden cabin deep in the pines of northern Montana, about 40 minutes from the nearest town. I wanted quiet, no traffic, no calls, no one asking me for anything. Just me, the trees, and the cold air. The road leading up to the property was narrow, barely wide enough for one car. Pine needles covered most of the dirt track, and every turn looked the same. By the time I reached the cabin, my cell signal had dropped to nothing, and I didn't mind. I had brought food, water, firewood, and a few books. Felt good to shut everything off. The cabin was small, one bedroom, a kitchen, and a sitting area with a fireplace. The wood outside was dark from years of weather, and the roof looked new. Behind it, a small shed leaned against a few thick pines. I parked my truck right in front, unloaded my bags, and stood for a while just listening. It was so quiet that I could hear the wind shifting through the needles. Inside, it smelled like old timber and smoke. The floor creaked under every step. There was a small fridge, a gas stove, a metal sink, and a counter barely wide enough to cut food on. The bathroom was cramped, just a toilet and a shower that looked like it hadn't been used in a while. I didn't care. It was simple, and it was mine for the weekend. That first night was calm. I cooked pasta, read by the fireplace, and drank a beer while listening to the wind scrape across the roof. It was colder than I expected, but the fire made it bearable. Before bed, I checked the door locks, 2 deadbolts on the front, 1 on the back. The cabin didn't feel unsafe, just isolated. When I lay down, I could hear the forest shifting, the distant groan of branches, the soft tapping of pine cones hitting the roof. Took a while to fall asleep, but eventually I did. When I woke up, something felt off. It wasn't anything obvious, the cabin looked the same, but the air inside felt disturbed, like the difference between a room you've just entered and one someone's just left. I shook it off and made coffee. Maybe I was just still adjusting to being totally alone. I spent most of that morning exploring the area. There was a narrow path behind the cabin that led into the woods. I followed it for about half a mile until I reached a clearing with a small pond. The water was dark and still, and when the wind stopped, the whole surface turned into a perfect mirror of the trees. I stood there for a while, breathing in the cold. By the time I got back, it was close to noon. I went inside, made lunch, and noticed something small that made my stomach tighten. The firewood stack beside the fireplace looked different. I had taken 3 logs the night before, but now the pile looked even too neat. Someone had res-tacked it. I told myself maybe I was remembering wrong. I had been tired. It was probably just me being too aware of details now that there was nothing else to focus on. The day passed quietly after that. I chopped some wood, read outside for a while, and watched the sky turn pink behind the trees. The nights came fast up there. By 6:30, it was already dark, and the woods felt endless in every direction. I built another fire and sat for a long time, just staring at it. When I went to bed that night, I made sure every door was locked again. The front and back doors both had thick iron bolts, and the windows had old wooden latches. I lay in bed listening to the fire crackle out in the main room. It must have been after midnight when I woke up again. At first, I wasn't sure why. Then I heard it, the faint sound of movement outside the cabin. It wasn't loud, just the slow crunch of pine needles, like someone stepping carefully. I held my breath. The sound came from behind the cabin, near the back door. I listened hard, waiting for it to stop, but it went on for several seconds, then faded. I didn't get up. I just lay there, staring into the dark. The forest made noises, animals, wind, maybe branches falling. I tried to tell myself that's all it was. Eventually, I fell asleep again. The next morning, I checked outside. There were footprints in the dirt behind the cabin. At first, I thought they were mine from when I carried wood around, but they were fresher and deeper, bigger than mine, too. They went around the back of the cabin toward the shed. I followed them a few feet, but they stopped near the trees. I looked around, scanning the woods, but there was nothing. The shed door was shut tight with a rusty latch. I pulled it open anyway. Inside, there were a few old tools, a tire, some rope, and a gas can. Nothing strange, but the ground inside was packed dirt, and there were marks like someone had dragged something heavy across it recently. I told myself it was probably animals again. That day, I couldn't relax. I kept catching myself glancing at the windows, checking the locks, listening for noises. I didn't go far from the cabin. By sunset, the air had dropped close to freezing. I lit the fireplace early, ate dinner, and double-checked the doors before bed. Took a long time to fall asleep. Every creak made me open my eyes. I remember hearing the wind hit the side of the cabin and thinking it sounded like someone brushing their hand against the wall. I must have dozed off because I woke again to the sound of something metallic. It was the back door handle. Turned slowly, stopped, then turned again. I froze. My heart started beating so hard I could feel it in my throat. The door didn't open, the bolt must have held, but the handle moved again, twice. Then silence. I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, I got up and went to the front room. The fire was out, and the air was freezing. I stood there listening. Nothing. Just the faint groan of trees outside. When the first light came through the window, I checked the back door. There were smudges on the metal handle. Not fingerprints, just blurred marks, like someone had touched it with gloves on. I decided I wasn't staying another night. I started packing up my things, but as I carried my bag outside, I noticed something near the edge of the woods. A piece of blue cloth caught on a branch. I walked over and pulled it free. It looked like part of a jacket sleeve torn at the seam. I looked around the woods again, feeling that same strange stillness as before, like the forest was holding its breath. I put the cloth in my pocket and went back inside. I wanted to leave right then, but the truck wouldn't start. The engine turned once and died. I tried again, nothing but a click. I checked under the hood, but I didn't know much about engines. The battery was connected, nothing looked loose, and I hadn't left the lights on. I slammed the hood shut and stood there in the cold. The nearest town was over 20 miles away. My phone still had no signal. I thought about walking, but I didn't have enough daylight left. I decided to stay one more night and leave early in the morning. I told myself whoever had been around the cabin probably just wandered through, maybe a hunter or hiker. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't as alone as I thought. That night, I didn't light the fire. I didn't want the light to show through the windows. I sat in the dark with a flashlight, facing the back door. Every small sound outside made my chest tighten. The hours crawled by. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the shed door creak open. The sound was soft but clear. I stood up slowly, trying not to make a sound. My flashlight was off, and I could barely see through the dark window. Then came footsteps, slow, steady, coming closer. They stopped right outside the back door. The handle moved again, this time faster. The door shook once, then stopped. I stepped back, heart racing so hard it hurt. After a few seconds, the footsteps moved away. I waited, barely breathing, then heard the shed door close again. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat by the window until the sun came up, gripping a kitchen knife. When it was light enough, I went outside. The dirt was marked with clear footprints, heavy boots, leading from the shed to the back door and back again. I walked to the shed and opened it. Inside, one of the tools, a hatchet I'd seen before, was missing. That was it for me. I threw my things in the truck again and tried starting it one more time. This time it turned over. I didn't question it, I just drove. As I backed out, I looked at the cabin one last time. The back door was closed, but the shed door was open again, just slightly, swinging in the wind. I drove until I reached a gas station near town. My hands were still shaking when I got out. I told the clerk the cabin's address and asked if anyone lived nearby. He said there were a few hunters who sometimes camped in those woods, but no permanent homes for miles. When I got home later that night, I emptied my bag and found that piece of blue cloth again. It was stiff with dirt, like it had been out there for a long time. I threw it away, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. A week later, I looked up the cabin listing online. The page was gone. The rental company said the property was no longer available. When I tried to ask why, they said the owner had removed it suddenly. No reason given. I don't know who was out there that night. Maybe someone living off the grid. Maybe just passing through. But someone knew that cabin was empty enough to watch. Sometimes I still think about those footprints, how deep they were, how they circled around the cabin before stopping at the door. I keep thinking about that missing hatchet. And every time I go camping now, I bring a spare car battery, and I never, ever stay somewhere that doesn't have neighbors close enough to hear me if I scream. I had been driving for almost 6 hours when I finally reached the narrow dirt road that wound through the trees. It was late afternoon, and the sun was hanging low behind the mountains. The sky was pale and cold-looking, the kind that makes the air feel heavier. I was tired, my back ached, and my eyes stung from staring at the road for too long. The tires crunched over gravel as I slowed down, passing through a thick forest of pine and birch. The road felt abandoned. Grass grew in the middle of it, and there were deep ruts on the sides where rainwater had carved little trenches. My old SUV bounced every few seconds. I had rented a small cabin for a few days to get away from work and city noise. I just wanted quiet. I had told myself that being alone in the woods for a few nights would help me clear my head, maybe sleep better for once. After another 10 minutes, the trees opened a little, and I saw the cabin. It sat on a slope facing a valley. The roof was metal and dull with rust, and there was a small porch with 2 steps leading up to the door. The wood looked gray and dry. Behind it, the forest climbed steeply uphill, dense with trees that blocked out most of the light. I parked beside the cabin and shut off the engine. For a moment, I just sat there listening to the ticking sound from the cooling engine and the faint hum of wind through the trees. There wasn't any other sound. No cars, no voices, no signs of anyone around. It felt heavy but peaceful in a strange way. I grabbed my backpack and a few bags of supplies from the back seat and went inside. The door creaked when I opened it. The inside was simple, wooden floors, a small kitchen area, one main room with a fireplace, and a bedroom off to the side. It smelled like dust and old wood. A faint smell of mildew hung in the air, but it wasn't strong enough to bother me. I checked the windows and the small back door. Everything was locked. The last renter had left some firewood stacked neatly beside the fireplace, and the caretaker had left a note on the table saying the well water was good for drinking. The power was on, though weak. The lights flickered a little when I tried the switch. I unpacked, changed into a sweatshirt, and stepped out onto the porch. The wind was colder now. It was quiet enough that I could hear my own breathing. The forest spread down into a wide hollow, and through the trees, I could see the glint of a stream. Across the valley, the other slope was covered with darker trees that looked almost black as the light faded. As I stood there, I noticed a faint path that led from the cabin toward the woods on the left side. It looked like an animal trail at first, narrow and uneven, but it curved into the trees and disappeared. I decided I'd check it out in the morning. When the sun dropped below the ridge, the air turned cold quickly. I went inside, made a small fire, and heated a can of soup. The flames flickered and made soft cracking noises. I sat in an old chair beside the fire and ate slowly, staring into the orange light. By the time I was done, it was completely dark outside. The cabin had one small window near the fireplace, and I could only see my own reflection in the glass. It felt strange being alone in a place like that, where the silence was so deep that every small sound stood out. I could hear the wood creaking softly as it cooled, and something light tapping outside now and then, maybe branches moving in the wind. Before going to bed, I went out onto the porch one last time. The night was cold enough that I could see my breath. The forest was a black wall. There wasn't a single light anywhere. No stars either, the clouds had covered the sky. I stayed there for maybe a minute, then went back in, locked the door, and went to bed. The bed was small and the mattress uneven, but I was too tired to care. I fell asleep fast, though I woke up a few times during the night. Every time I did, I could hear small noises, something brushing lightly against the outside wall, or what sounded like footsteps on dry leaves far off. I kept telling myself it was just animals, probably deer or raccoons, but I still didn't sleep much after that. The next morning, I made coffee and sat on the porch again. The fog was thick, rolling through the trees like smoke. It felt damp and cold on my skin. The ground glistened from the night's dew, and everything smelled like wet pine. After breakfast, I decided to follow that trail I had seen. I packed a small bottle of water, a granola bar, and my pocket knife just in case. The path started narrow but slowly became clearer as I went deeper. It led through dense trees, over roots and small rocks, and then began to climb slightly uphill. It was quiet except for birds and the occasional rustle of leaves. The fog made it hard to see far ahead. I walked for maybe 20 minutes when I noticed something odd. A faint smell of smoke. It wasn't strong, but it was definitely there. I stopped and looked around. Through the trees, the fog seemed thicker in one direction. I followed the smell slowly, stepping carefully over fallen branches. After a few minutes, I came to a small clearing. The ground was trampled, and there were pieces of burnt wood arranged in a rough circle, like someone had made a campfire there not long ago. A few beer cans lay scattered, some crushed, and there was a torn blanket half buried in dirt. The ashes in the fire ring were still dark gray, not white, which meant the fire hadn't been dead for long. I knelt and touched the edge of one of the larger pieces of wood. It was still faintly warm. Someone had been here maybe that morning or the night before. That didn't bother me at first. People camp in places like this all the time. But what felt strange was how close it was to the cabin. Couldn't have been more than half a mile away. I hadn't seen or heard anyone when I arrived. I looked around the area more. There were footprints in the dirt, a few small and a few larger, but the ground was uneven and soft, so they were hard to read. Some of them led deeper into the forest, heading in the same direction the path continued. I stood there for a while, listening, but heard nothing. The fog was thick enough that I could only see a few trees ahead. The quiet made me uneasy, so I decided to go back. On my way back to the cabin, I noticed something I hadn't before. Near the start of the trail, just a few yards from the clearing, there was a small piece of rope tied around a tree trunk, cut off on one end. It was rough and frayed, like it had been pulled hard. I didn't touch it. I just kept walking until the cabin came into view through the fog. The rest of the day was calm. I chopped some wood, cleaned a few cobwebs inside, and read a book I had brought. The sound of birds filled the afternoon, and for a while it felt peaceful again. When evening came, I cooked some rice on the stove and sat on the porch while eating. The wind had picked up again, and the temperature dropped fast. The fog was gone now, and I could see down the slope into the dark forest. Somewhere far away, I thought I saw a flicker of light between the trees, just for a second. It looked like the reflection of a flame, small and quick. Could have been anything. A campfire from whoever had been at that clearing. I tried to ignore it, but my eyes kept going back to the spot, waiting to see it again. The light didn't appear anymore, though. As night came, the woods grew black and silent again. I went inside, made another small fire, and sat near it. The longer I sat there, the more I noticed how the quiet seemed heavier now. Every little creak from the wood made me turn my head. At some point, I heard something distinct. It wasn't wind or branches. It was a sound like soft steps on leaves outside the window, slow and uneven. I froze, staring at the glass. The window was dark, only reflecting the faint orange from the fire. I couldn't see anything outside. The steps stopped after a few seconds. Then I heard a faint scrape, like something brushing against the wall near the corner of the cabin. I sat still, listening. My heartbeat was loud in my chest. The scraping sound came again, softer, then stopped. I got up quietly and went to the door. I didn't open it, just checked that the lock was set. It was. I stood there for maybe a full minute, waiting, hearing nothing but the wind starting to rise. After a while, I told myself it was probably a branch or an animal again. I forced myself to sit back down. Still, I couldn't relax. I barely took my eyes off the window. The fire had burned low, and shadows moved slowly across the ceiling. I added a few pieces of wood, trying to push the unease out of my head. By the time I went to bed, it was past midnight. The wind outside had turned into short, sharp gusts that rattled the loose boards on the porch. I left the fire burning low in the main room, locked the bedroom door out of habit, and got under the blanket. Took a long time to fall asleep. My mind kept replaying that sound, the steps, the scrape. I told myself again and again it was nothing, but the silence between the gusts made it worse. Every time the wind stopped, I listened for something else. Somewhere in the middle of the night, I woke up again. The firelight was still flickering faintly through the crack under the door. The air was cold. I lay there listening. Then I heard it again. A slow, steady sound from outside. Not close at first. It was like someone stepping on frozen leaves or gravel, coming from the direction of the woods. The steps were faint but steady, moving toward the cabin. I held my breath. They stopped for a few seconds, then started again, slower this time. I could hear them getting closer to the front porch. I turned my head toward the bedroom window, but it was too dark to see anything. The steps reached the porch. The wood creaked softly under the weight. My chest felt tight. I didn't move. The sound stopped again. For maybe 10 seconds, there was nothing. Then a faint metallic rattle, like someone touching the door handle. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I stared at the ceiling, not moving, barely breathing. The sound stopped. Then came one slow step, maybe shifting weight. Another soft creak from the porch floorboards. Then nothing. No footsteps going away. No sound at all. I lay there for what felt like an hour before I finally heard the wind again. I didn't sleep after that. I just waited until the faint gray of dawn started to show through the window. When the sun finally rose, I got up and went to check. I opened the bedroom door slowly, half expecting to hear something move in the other room. Everything looked the same. The fire had gone out, and the air was cold. I went to the door and looked at the lock. It was still in place. Then I stepped outside. The morning air was freezing. The ground was covered with a thin layer of frost, and the trees were quiet. I looked down at the dirt in front of the porch. There were marks in it. Not clear footprints, but the ground looked disturbed, like someone had stepped there and turned around a few times. The frost was crushed in a few spots. The direction of the marks led from the trees toward the steps, and then back toward the woods. I stared at them for a long time. My mind felt foggy from lack of sleep, and part of me wanted to believe it was nothing. Maybe an animal again. But the pattern didn't look like anything I'd seen before. That day, I stayed near the cabin. I didn't go back into the woods. I spent most of the morning checking the area around the cabin, trying to find more signs. Behind the cabin, near the small back door, I noticed another mark in the soft dirt, like a heel print, just one half covered in leaves. By the afternoon, I decided I'd leave early the next morning. I told myself it was just because of the cold, but deep down I knew it was because of what I'd heard. I didn't feel right staying there another night. That evening, I stacked extra wood inside, packed most of my things, and kept the fire strong. I didn't turn off any lights. The wind was calm that night, which made every small noise stand out even more. I kept checking the window, expecting to see movement outside. The forest was just a wall of black. It must have been close to midnight when I heard something again. This time it wasn't from the porch. It came from the back of the cabin. A dull thump, then another softer, like something brushing or bumping against the wall. I froze again, staring toward the back door. The noise came once more, a faint scraping sound. I picked up my flashlight and aimed it toward the sound. The back door was locked, but I could see the handle twitch slightly, just once, as if it had been nudged. Then silence again. I stayed awake for hours, sitting near the fireplace, waiting for another sound. But none came. When dawn finally came again, I packed the rest of my things, loaded the SUV, and took one last look around. The dirt behind the cabin was disturbed again, faintly, like someone had stepped there during the night. I started the car, drove down the dirt road, and didn't stop until I reached the main highway. Only when I was miles away did I finally start to feel my hands stop shaking. But I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching that cabin from the woods. Maybe the same person who'd camped near it before I arrived. Maybe someone who hadn't wanted me there. I told myself I'd forget about it, but even weeks later, I'd wake up at night remembering the sound of those slow steps on the porch, the door handle rattling once, and the way the frost had been crushed outside in the exact shape of where someone had stood for too long. I remember the first time I saw the cabin. It sat alone at the end of a dirt road that wound through dense pine forest, about 6 miles from the main highway. The air out there always smelled like wet earth and sap, and when the wind moved through the trees, it made this low, endless sound like the ocean far away. I had rented the cabin for a week just to get away from work and noise, to have some time by myself. I wasn't expecting luxury. The photos online had shown a small wooden place with a tin roof, a single porch, and an outhouse off to the side. That was fine with me. I just wanted quiet and space to breathe. The road to the cabin was narrow and uneven. My truck bounced on every hole and rock. The trees on both sides grew so close together that in some spots the branches brushed the mirrors. I had no cell service by the time I reached the last mile. When I finally saw the clearing and the dark brown cabin sitting there, I felt a little relief. It looked exactly like the pictures. The grass around it was tall and uneven. There were a few stumps where someone had cut trees long ago. A thin stream ran behind the cabin, and there was a small fire pit made of stones near the porch. Inside was simple: one room with a small table, a wood stove, a bed with an old mattress, and a single window facing the forest. The floorboards creaked with every step, and there was that smell old wood gets when it's been closed up for a while. A mix of dust and sap and something slightly damp. I unpacked my things: a small bag of food, some clothes, a lantern, and my hunting knife. I had brought a cooler with some ice, but I knew it wouldn't last the whole week. I'd have to rely mostly on dry food and whatever I could cook on the stove or fire. The first evening was peaceful. I gathered some wood from around the clearing, stacked it near the porch, and started a fire. The sun went down slowly behind the trees, turning the sky orange, then red, then dark blue. I could hear crickets start up and somewhere far off an owl. I sat on the porch with my lantern and watched the woods fade into darkness. The silence out there was heavy but kind of nice. I went to bed early, listening to the wind against the roof. That night, I woke up once around midnight. It was the kind of waking where you don't know why. You just suddenly open your eyes and stare into darkness. The cabin was quiet except for the faint sound of the stream. I couldn't tell what had woken me. Maybe the wind, maybe a branch falling. I listened for a long time, then drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I made coffee on the small stove and stepped outside. The air was cold. I could see my breath. The forest looked calm again, sunlight slipping through the branches. I decided to take a walk down the logging road to see where it led. I followed it for about an hour, hearing nothing but birds and the crunch of gravel under my boots. Eventually, I turned back. I didn't see another person, not even tire tracks newer than my own. Later that day, I started noticing small things. The first was a single footprint in the mud near the stream. It wasn't mine. It was older, maybe a day or two, and it looked like a work boot. There was only one, and I didn't think much of it. Maybe a hunter had passed through. But then, near the outhouse, I found a crushed cigarette butt. I don't smoke, and I hadn't seen one in the cabin. The paper was soggy from rain, so it wasn't fresh, but it made me think that maybe someone else used the cabin recently, maybe without permission. By the third day, the air had changed. Clouds moved in, and the woods looked darker even in the afternoon. The wind picked up and carried a strange echo through the trees, the kind that makes you stop for a second because you can't tell if it's an animal or something else. I stayed near the cabin that day, chopping wood and trying to keep busy. Around evening, I started the fire pit and cooked a can of beans. I sat there listening to the fire crackle when I thought I heard something faint behind the trees, like a footstep in dry leaves. I looked up but didn't see anything. The forest just stood there, thick and silent. I told myself it was probably an animal. That night I had trouble sleeping. Every time the wind changed, it made the cabin creak. I lay there staring at the ceiling, thinking about that footprint and the cigarette. Sometime around 2 a.m., I heard something faint outside. A slow, steady sound, like someone walking on the porch. The boards made this dull groan under weight. I held my breath. It stopped. Then I heard what sounded like a light tap near the door. I froze, listening. Nothing else came. The wind blew again, and I wondered if I had imagined it. I didn't move for a long time. Eventually, I reached for my knife and kept it close. I must have stayed like that until I fell asleep sometime before dawn. When I woke up, it was gray outside. I opened the door and looked around. The ground was damp from light rain, and the air smelled fresh. I checked the porch. There were no clear footprints, but the wood had dark spots where something wet had dripped. Could have been rain. Could have been nothing. But my gut told me someone had been there. I decided to stay alert. I spent the morning walking the area around the cabin. About 50 yards into the trees, I found what looked like a small path. Faint but there. It ran parallel to the stream and disappeared deeper into the woods. It didn't look like an animal trail. It was too even. I followed it for a while, maybe half a mile, until I came across a broken-down shack made of old planks. It looked abandoned for years. The roof was half gone and the inside was filled with leaves and mud. I noticed boot prints in the soft dirt near the entrance, fresher than the ones I'd seen before. That made my stomach tighten. I turned back to the cabin quickly, checking behind me every few minutes. The woods felt different then, heavier somehow. When I got back, I locked the door and stayed inside for most of the afternoon. The rain came back stronger and hit the roof in steady waves. I tried to distract myself by writing in my notebook and reading an old magazine I'd brought, but I couldn't stop thinking about that shack and the footprints. As it got dark, I kept the lantern low and listened. The rain stopped sometime around 10 p.m., leaving only dripping sounds from the roof. The silence that followed felt too deep, like everything outside was waiting. I didn't sleep much that night. Around midnight again, I heard that same soft creak on the porch. This time I was sure. It wasn't the wind. It was slow and careful, one step at a time. My chest tightened. I could feel my heartbeat in my neck. Then I heard a scrape, like something brushing against the wall near the window. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. After a few minutes, it stopped. The only sound left was the stream again. I stayed awake until morning light started seeping through the window. When I finally stepped outside, there were muddy footprints on the porch. Clear ones this time. They were from boots, size about like mine but with a deeper tread. They led from the edge of the clearing up to the door and then turned around back toward the woods. My stomach felt cold when I saw them. Someone had definitely been there. I checked the woods around the clearing, but there was nothing else. No person, no sound, just the smell of wet pine and dirt. I went back inside and tried to calm myself down. Maybe some hunter was lost. Maybe he thought the cabin was empty. I told myself I'd stay one more night, then leave early the next morning. That seemed reasonable. All day, I kept glancing at the tree line. The forest was so dense that you could barely see 30 feet in. Every time a branch moved, I felt my body tense. I tried to go about things normally. Made a fire, cooked a little food, filled my canteen from the stream, but I never stopped listening. Around sunset, I stacked wood inside by the stove and locked the door. I left the lantern off and sat in the dark. I figured if anyone came again, I'd hear them before they saw me. Hours passed slowly. The air inside the cabin felt stale. My eyes adjusted enough that I could see the outline of the door and window. Around midnight again, it started. The sound of footsteps, light but sure, moving around the porch. Then silence. Then the door handle moved, just a small rattle like someone testing it. I gripped the knife so hard my hand hurt. The handle stopped moving. Then came a sound like soft breathing near the window. I stayed still, trying not to even blink. The breathing was faint but real, right outside the glass. After a minute, it faded. The footsteps moved away, slow, then faster, until I couldn't hear them anymore. I sat there until the first light of dawn came. When I finally looked outside, I saw more footprints. This time they went not only to the porch but around the cabin, stopping near the window and the back wall. I followed them a little way into the trees, but they disappeared where the ground turned rocky. That was it for me. I packed my things fast. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. My hands were shaking as I loaded the truck. I wanted to be gone before whoever it was came back. When I started driving down that narrow road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, expecting to see someone step out of the trees. I didn't, but a few miles down, I noticed something odd. Deep in the mud near the bend was a second set of tire tracks that hadn't been there when I arrived. They led toward the cabin. That hit me harder than anything else. Someone had been up there in a vehicle, maybe during the night or early morning. I didn't stop to check. I drove straight to the highway and didn't look back until the cabin was completely gone from view. When I reached the nearest gas station, I told the owner that someone might be trespassing around that old cabin. He just shrugged and said the property had been empty on and off for years, and sometimes people stayed there without telling anyone. He mentioned that years ago, some logging worker had lived out there alone and gone missing, but they never found anything. I didn't ask more. I just wanted to leave it all behind. Even now, months later, I think about those footprints, the way they circled the cabin, the breathing at the window. I never saw a face, never heard a voice, but I know someone was out there, someone watching. Maybe they lived in that old shack I found. Maybe they'd been using the cabin before I rented it. Maybe they thought I was the intruder. Whatever it was, I left them their woods. I never went back. The rental company sent me an email a few weeks later asking if I wanted to book again. I didn't reply. Sometimes late at night when I think about it, I can almost feel that same quiet pressure in the air, like someone standing just outside, waiting for the lights to go out again. I had been driving for hours before I finally saw the narrow dirt road winding through the forest, flanked by tall pines that blocked out the late afternoon sun. My old sedan rattled over the uneven path, the tires crunching against loose gravel and fallen pine needles. The cabin was supposed to be secluded, far enough from the town to offer peace and quiet, and I had chosen it for exactly that reason. I didn't want people around. I needed time alone to think, to clear my mind after the months that had felt heavy and relentless. The GPS had stopped working a few miles back. I wasn't surprised. Cell service rarely reached this deep into the woods. The directions from the booking site were vague, but at least better than nothing. Turn left at the fallen birch tree, continue past the small creek, and the cabin would be on the right, hidden behind a curve in the road. My hands gripped the steering wheel a little tighter as the forest closed in around me. There was no one else in sight, and no other cars had passed me since I had left the main highway. Eventually, I saw it. A small wooden cabin with faded green shutters and a stone chimney. It looked almost as though it had been there forever, like it belonged in that clearing. The windows reflected the sun's last rays, and a thin trail of smoke curled lazily from the chimney. I parked on a patch of uneven ground beside a cluster of pine trees and got out. The air was cooler than I expected, heavy with the smell of damp earth and pine sap. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension in my shoulders start to ease. I had made it. The cabin's door creaked as I pushed it open. Inside, it smelled faintly of old wood and dust. Sunlight filtered in through the dirty windows, revealing a small, sparsely furnished space. There was a wooden table, a couple of chairs, a small stove, and a single bed against the far wall. The walls were bare, save for a few shelves holding basic kitchenware. It wasn't luxurious, but it was quiet, and for now it was enough. I set my bags down and wandered around, inspecting the cabin. The windows were all intact, the locks old but functional. There were no signs of recent visitors, no footprints in the dust, no forgotten items left behind. Even so, I felt the odd prickling at the back of my neck that always came when I was somewhere unfamiliar. I shook it off, reminding myself I was alone and perfectly safe. After unpacking, I decided to take a short walk around the cabin. The forest was dense, the ground uneven and littered with fallen branches. The sky was fading to a deep blue, and the shadows of the trees stretched long across the clearing. I followed a narrow path that led toward a small creek I had passed on the way in. The sound of water trickling over rocks was comforting, almost meditative. I lingered there for a few minutes, listening to the quiet, letting my mind settle. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something odd. One of the windows on the side facing the forest was slightly open. I was certain I had closed it before leaving, and there was no breeze strong enough to push it open by itself. My stomach sank slightly. I went over and checked the latch. It was intact. No sign of forced entry, no footprints leading to or from the window. Still, the unease lingered. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe the previous tenants had left it ajar. Maybe the wood had shifted in the day's heat. I set about preparing a simple dinner on the small stove. The flickering flame threw shadows on the walls, and I caught myself glancing toward the window more often than I cared to admit. Every sound outside, the snap of a branch, the rustle of leaves, made me tense. Night was coming faster than I expected, and the forest had already started to feel oppressive. By the time I was done eating, darkness had fallen completely. The cabin felt smaller now, the corners of the room swallowed by shadows. I lit a few candles I had brought with me, placing them on the table and windowsill. The soft glow was comforting, but it did little to ease the nervous energy coiling in my chest. I tried reading, but my mind kept drifting to every small noise, every slight movement outside. A deer snapped a twig in the distance, and I flinched, heart racing. Hours passed slowly. I finally decided to sleep, convincing myself that my imagination was getting the better of me. I double-checked the locks on the doors and windows before climbing into the bed. The mattress was thin, the blanket worn, but it was enough to make me feel a small measure of comfort. I drifted off reluctantly, my senses still alert despite the exhaustion. I woke in the middle of the night to a noise I could not immediately identify. At first, it was just a faint thud, almost like something rolling across the wooden floor. My eyes adjusted to the dim candlelight, and I sat up slowly, straining to see. The cabin was silent, but then I heard it again, a soft, deliberate scraping coming from the other side of the room. Panic rose in my chest. I grabbed the small flashlight I had packed and swept it across the cabin. The beam landed on the window I had noticed earlier. There was nothing there, nothing at all. But then, faintly, I saw it. A shadow moving outside, tall and just at the edge of the trees. I froze. My mind raced. There was no sound other than the wind rustling through the branches. But that shadow, something had been there. I decided to stay awake, pacing the cabin with the flashlight in hand. Hours passed, and my eyes grew tired, but I couldn't risk sleep. I felt trapped, the walls closing in, the forest pressing against the cabin from all sides. Every creak of the old wood made me jump. My imagination tried to fill in the gaps, but I forced myself to remember that the forest was full of animals, that I was alone, and that there was no reason for anyone to be there. By morning, I was exhausted. I hadn't slept at all. The sun's rays felt almost unnatural as they spilled into the cabin. I stepped outside to get some air, the fresh light cutting through the oppressive shadows of the forest. Everything looked calm, normal, almost peaceful. I told myself that last night had been paranoia, that isolation had amplified every sound and shadow. I spent the day cautiously exploring the area around the cabin. I marked a few trees to remind myself of the path and checked the creek for signs of animals or people. There were deer tracks, small footprints of raccoons, nothing unusual. Yet the feeling of being watched lingered. I tried to keep busy, chopping firewood, tidying the cabin, and preparing food. I avoided the window I had noticed the night before, unwilling to face the memory of that shadow. The second night, the noises started again. At first, they were faint, easily dismissible, a rustle here, a creak there. But gradually, they became more pronounced. Something or someone was moving around the cabin. Not animals, not raccoons or deer. These were deliberate movements. Scraping, thumping, pacing. My fear was now sharper, focused, and I realized that hiding behind rational explanations was not enough to calm it. I checked the doors and windows multiple times, ensuring everything was locked. I pushed heavy furniture against the doors for extra security, creating barricades with whatever I could find. My mind raced through possibilities, from intruders seeking shelter to people with worse intentions. I had no way to call for help. No one knew where I was, and the road back to the main highway was several miles of rough terrain. The night was long, each sound magnified in the small cabin. I could hear footsteps circling outside, a deliberate pacing that seemed to move closer with every passing hour. My flashlight batteries were running low, leaving me in near darkness at times, and every shadow seemed to grow taller and more threatening. Sleep was impossible, my body trembling with tension. Then, around dawn, the noises stopped. The forest grew quiet, the soft morning light filtering through the trees. I peered through the window, but there was no sign of anyone or anything. I dared to step outside, scanning the perimeter carefully. There were no footprints near the cabin, no disturbed soil, nothing to explain the sounds of the night. I felt relief and frustration in equal measure. Relief that the night had passed without incident, frustration at the mystery and the fear it had brought. I spent the next few days cautiously exploring further, making small trips down the dirt road, checking nearby streams, and observing the forest from different vantage points. I discovered the cabin had been used sporadically by hunters and hikers, leaving behind small clearings and makeshift trails. That knowledge calmed me somewhat. Perhaps last night had been caused by another person seeking shelter, a transient like me, or maybe it was the echoes of wildlife I had misinterpreted in my fear. By the end of the week, I had grown more confident. I kept watch during the night but allowed myself short naps during the day. I repaired the cabin, reinforcing windows and doors, setting up a fire pit outside to create the sense of a lived-in space. Slowly, the forest began to feel less threatening, more familiar. I even found moments of peace, sitting on the porch, listening to the creak, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a hawk. When it came time to leave, I felt a strange sense of attachment to the cabin. The fear had been real, the nights had been tense and exhausting, but I had faced them and survived. I packed my bags, locked the doors, and walked down the dirt road one last time. The forest seemed less imposing now, more ordinary. I had learned that fear could amplify shadows and sounds, but that preparation, awareness, and calm could counter it. Driving back to the highway, I looked in the rearview mirror at the narrowing road disappearing behind the trees. I knew I would remember that cabin, the isolation, and the nights of tension. But I also knew I had left stronger, more resilient, and more confident in my ability to handle the unknown. The forest was quiet, the cabin stood undisturbed, and the sun rose higher in the sky, casting light on everything, showing the world as it truly was. That trip had been scary, exhausting, and full of uncertainty, yet it ended with a clear sense of accomplishment. I had survived solitude, faced fear, and left the cabin intact. The forest had not harmed me, and I had not harmed it. I drove on with a newfound respect for the quiet, hidden places of the world, and a deeper understanding of my own limits and strengths. The cabin remained behind me, a place of tension transformed into a memory of triumph. It started as an ordinary trip. I had been planning it for months, a weekend away from the city, somewhere quiet and far from people, where the roads ended and the forest began. I wanted a cabin that would be isolated, surrounded by nothing but trees and the faint sound of wind through the pines. I had imagined myself waking up to the smell of damp earth and pine needles, spending my mornings with a cup of coffee, listening to the birds, and my evenings by a small fire, reading a book. The pictures on the website had shown a small wooden cabin tucked into the woods, with a narrow dirt road leading up to it, and I thought it would be perfect. I arrived late on a Friday afternoon, driving my small car over the uneven dirt road. The tires kicked up dust and the engine made a low hum as I climbed the incline, branches brushing against the sides of the car. The sun was beginning to dip, painting the sky in pale orange and fading blue, the kind of light that made shadows sharp and long. I parked near the cabin and stepped out, stretching my legs after the long drive. The cabin was exactly as it had looked in the photos. Simple, wooden, with a small porch and 2 windows that reflected the fading sunlight. There was a woodpile stacked neatly beside the cabin and a small trail that seemed to disappear into the forest behind it. The door creaked as I pushed it open, and I stepped inside. It smelled of old wood and a faint hint of dampness, like the cabin had been closed up for a while. I had brought supplies: a few cans of food, bottled water, a lantern, and a backpack with some basic camping gear in case I wanted to hike into the forest. The cabin had electricity, but I wasn't sure how reliable it was. So I unpacked the lantern and set it on the small table in the corner. The interior was small but cozy. A kitchen area with a counter and sink, a small stove, and a living area with a couch and a chair. A narrow staircase led up to a loft with a bed and a window that looked out over the trees. As the light dimmed, I lit the lantern and began to unpack. Outside, the wind had started to pick up, rustling the trees in a way that made them sound alive. It wasn't unpleasant, just noticeable. I made myself a simple dinner from the canned food, heating it on the stove, and ate slowly, enjoying the quiet. By the time I finished, the sky had darkened, and the forest had become a wall of black around the cabin. The lantern cast a soft, flickering light, making shadows dance on the walls. I moved through the cabin slowly, checking the windows and doors to make sure everything was secure. It was then that I first noticed it, a movement outside the window. At first, I thought it was the wind or a stray branch brushing against the glass, but then I saw it again. A shape crouched low, moving between the trees. I froze, trying to make out what it was. It was too dark to see clearly, just a dark outline, but it was definitely moving with intent, slowly and deliberately. My heart started to race. I told myself it was probably a deer or some other animal, but something about the way it moved made me uneasy. I decided not to investigate. I locked the door again and pulled the curtains closed. I told myself to stay calm, that it was just the woods, just shadows. I tried to read a book to distract myself, but I kept hearing small sounds outside. A snap of a branch, a rustle of leaves, the faint crunch of something moving on the dirt outside. Every sound made me jump, my nerves on edge. I realized I hadn't thought to bring a phone signal booster. I didn't know if I even had cell service out here, and I hadn't tested it. By the time I went to bed, I was exhausted and tense. I lay in the loft bed, the blanket pulled up to my chin, listening. The wind had died down a little, but there was still a subtle sound outside, like something brushing against the undergrowth, moving slowly, stopping, listening. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Eventually, fatigue took over, and I fell into an uneasy sleep. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of something against the cabin. It wasn't a loud noise, more like a tapping, light and deliberate. My eyes snapped open, straining in the darkness. I held my breath, listening. The tapping continued, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. My stomach twisted into knots. Whoever or whatever was out there seemed to know I was inside. I wanted to get up and check, but fear pinned me to the bed. The rational part of my mind said it had to be an animal, a raccoon or something small, but every instinct screamed that it was human, and I wasn't sure of their intentions. I stayed frozen until the first hint of light appeared at the edges of the loft window. The tapping had stopped. My body was tense, sore, and exhausted, but I didn't sleep again. I dressed quickly, putting on every layer I had brought, and grabbed the backpack I had prepared for emergencies. I looked out the window and into the forest. There was nothing there now, just the trees, swaying slightly in the early morning wind. No footprints, no signs of recent activity, nothing to prove my fears. I decided to leave immediately. I needed to get out before someone or something decided to reveal itself again. I packed the essentials: water, food, first aid kit, and my jacket. I kept one hand on the small pocket knife I had brought, just in case. I opened the door slowly and stepped outside, scanning the tree line. The dirt road was visible, and I could see where it curved down the hill, leading to a main road several miles away. I started walking briskly, staying alert for any signs of movement. Every crack of a branch made me jump. Every rustle of leaves made my heart race. Halfway down the road, I heard it, a voice distant, low, calling my name. I froze, my stomach dropping. It was definitely human. The sound came from deeper in the forest, following the road I had just come from. My first thought was to run, but I forced myself to stay calm and keep moving steadily. I knew panic would make me stumble, and stumbling here could be dangerous. I kept walking, trying to stay on the main path. The voice grew slightly louder, then faded as I continued moving. I didn't look back. By the time I reached a point where the trees thinned and I could see the main road, I spotted a car in the distance. I waved frantically, hoping the driver would see me. The car slowed and stopped. The driver, an older man who had been passing through, listened to my story in short, tense bursts. He offered to drive me to the nearest town, which was over an hour away, and I gratefully accepted. As we drove, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone, or something, emerging from the forest behind us. But the road remained empty, the trees swaying quietly in the morning wind. When I reached the town, I went straight to the local authorities. They took my report seriously, sent a few patrols to check the area, and assured me that they would look into any suspicious activity near the cabin. I didn't return to the cabin. Weeks later, I learned that someone had been caught trying to break into a series of isolated cabins in that forest. They hadn't harmed anyone yet, but they were looking for places to hide and had been watching people for weeks. The relief I felt was immense. I realized how close I had come to danger and how easily I could have been caught if I had stayed one more night. I also understood the importance of preparation and caution in isolated areas. That weekend, which had been meant to be peaceful and restorative, had turned into one of the scariest experiences of my life. But I survived, and I learned from it. I returned to the city with a renewed sense of awareness, grateful for my instincts, my preparedness, and the strangers who had helped me. I never went back to that cabin, and I never planned to, but the forest still calls to me in my memories, a reminder that isolation can be dangerous, and that sometimes the most frightening things are not imagined. They are real, and they are waiting in the shadows. I had been driving for hours before I found the dirt road that led to the cabin. The GPS had started acting strange once I left the main highway, and the signal kept dropping in and out. I remember thinking that if I kept following it blindly, I might end up somewhere I didn't want to be. But the cabin was supposed to be isolated, and I needed the quiet. The plan was simple. A week alone in the woods, no distractions, no internet, just silence and the sound of wind through trees. I had been under a lot of stress, and this trip felt like the only way to clear my mind. The last stretch of road was worse than I imagined. The gravel turned to loose dirt, the path narrowed between thick pine trees that blocked the sun, and occasional deep ruts told me I wasn't the only one who had struggled to get here. I drove slowly, gripping the wheel tighter each time the car hit a patch of soft mud. I knew that if I got stuck here, it could take hours, maybe even a whole day, to get help. But the thought of turning back never crossed my mind. I was determined to get there. When the cabin finally came into view, it looked even more remote than I expected. It sat in a small clearing, surrounded by thick trees, with no neighbors in sight. The structure was old but sturdy. Weathered wooden planks had darkened over time, and the roof had patches that looked like they had been repaired many years ago. A stone chimney rose on one side, and smoke stains blackened the upper logs. The porch sagged slightly, and the steps creaked under my weight as I climbed out of the car. The air was cold and damp, smelling of wet soil and pine needles. I paused for a moment to take it in. The isolation felt heavier than I expected, almost pressing in on me from all sides. Inside, the cabin was simple. A small living area with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with only the basics, and a single bedroom upstairs. Dust covered the surfaces, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. I unpacked my few belongings and set up my sleeping area, making sure I had everything I needed for the first night. I checked the windows and doors, making sure they were locked and secure. I had learned from experience that being in the woods meant being cautious. The first evening passed quietly. I chopped some firewood from the pile near the cabin and built a small fire in the fireplace. The flames cast shadows across the walls, and the sound of the crackling wood was strangely comforting. I ate a simple meal and then settled into a chair near the fire, feeling the warmth seep into my bones. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, and an occasional bird call broke the silence. I tried to read, but my mind kept wandering. I felt a strange tension in the air, a heaviness that I couldn't shake. Around midnight, I woke up suddenly. The fire had died down, leaving the room dark and cold. I could hear the wind picking up outside, making the trees groan and scrape against each other. At first, I thought I had heard someone outside. My heart rate spiked. I stayed very still, listening. The noises were subtle, almost like footsteps, but I couldn't be sure. I reminded myself that the woods were full of animals, and the old cabin creaked and shifted with the wind. Still, I couldn't fall back asleep. I kept imagining shadows moving across the walls, shapes that weren't really there. The next morning, I went outside to check the surroundings. The dirt road looked rougher than before, and the mud from the night's rain had deepened. My car had a few spots of wet dirt on the tires, but it was fine. I decided to explore the nearby woods cautiously, staying close to the cabin. The forest was dense, with fallen trees, thick underbrush, and uneven ground. I marked my path mentally so I could find my way back. As I walked, I noticed the silence. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the kind that presses in, heavy and unsettling. There were no sounds of other humans, no distant vehicles, just the occasional bird and the rustle of leaves. It made me uneasy in a way I couldn't explain. By the third day, I began to notice small, troubling things. My food supply had been packed tightly, but some cans had shifted in the backpack, as if they had been moved. At first, I blamed myself for forgetting to pack them carefully. Later, I found footprints near the cabin. They weren't mine. They were human but small, almost like a teenager's or a small adult. They led up to the edge of the woods and stopped. I tried to convince myself it was someone passing by, maybe a hiker, but the feeling of being watched began to grow. I started sleeping with a knife nearby and made sure to secure all the doors and windows at night. The fourth night was the worst. A storm rolled in, and the wind became violent. Rain hammered against the roof and windows, and the cabin shuddered with the gusts. I could hear trees cracking and branches snapping outside. At one point, I swore I heard someone walking on the porch, soft but deliberate steps. I froze, listening. The storm made it impossible to tell if it was real or just my imagination, but I couldn't ignore it. I stayed crouched near the fireplace, gripping the knife tightly, my ears straining to catch any sound over the storm. The night seemed endless. I fell asleep only when exhaustion took over, my body tense and alert. When morning came, the storm had passed. I stepped outside to assess the damage. A few branches had fallen near the cabin, and some had struck the roof, causing minor damage. My car was still safe, but I realized the storm had made the dirt road almost impassable. If I needed to leave quickly, it would be difficult. I inspected the perimeter carefully and found more footprints in the soft ground. They were fresher than the ones from before. Someone had been close to the cabin last night. My stomach sank. I realized that no matter how careful I was, someone might be watching me, or worse, waiting. I spent the next day preparing for the possibility of needing to defend myself. I collected extra firewood, sharpened my knife, and created a simple alarm system using tin cans and string around the cabin's perimeter. It was primitive, but it would make a loud noise if anyone approached. I also kept the car keys and phone in my pocket at all times. I knew that even though the area was remote, I couldn't take any chances. The fifth night, I barely slept. I kept hearing noises outside, subtle rustling, occasional knocks against the cabin walls, and the sound of footsteps that stopped as soon as I paid attention. My imagination ran wild, but I refused to ignore the evidence of the footprints. At one point, I saw a shadow move past the window, fast and deliberate. I gripped the knife tightly, my heart hammering in my chest. I stayed in the corner of the room, watching every window, every door. Hours passed like minutes, and when dawn finally arrived, I felt both relief and exhaustion. The following days were a mix of tension and hyper-awareness. I barely left the cabin, only for essential trips to check water sources or gather firewood. Every sound in the forest, every movement in the trees, made me jump. I started keeping a journal, documenting the footprints, noises, and unusual events. It helped me feel some control over the situation. I realized that whoever or whatever was around the cabin, I needed a plan to leave safely. I couldn't stay trapped here. On the 8th day, I finally decided I had enough. I packed my belongings quickly, double-checked the locks, and approached the car. I noticed fresh footprints leading from the woods directly toward the cabin. Panic surged, but I reminded myself to stay calm. I kept the knife ready and moved slowly, scanning every shadow. I got into the car and locked the doors. For several minutes, I sat there, engine off, listening. The woods were silent again, but I didn't trust it. I started the engine and drove slowly down the dirt road, ready to stop at the first sign of trouble. The footprints in the mud were still visible at the edge of the clearing. As I moved further away, I realized the road was rougher than I thought. The car bottomed out on a few ruts, and I had to drive carefully to avoid getting stuck. The isolation that once seemed peaceful now felt threatening, and I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes watching me from the forest. After about an hour of careful driving, I reached a small main road. Relief flooded through me as the landscape began to change, the trees thinning and signs of civilization appearing. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station. I filled up the tank and called a friend to let them know I was okay. The voice on the other end sounded distant and calm, almost unreal after the tension of the past days. I promised myself I wouldn't go anywhere that remote alone again. When I returned home, I spent hours washing the cabin's dust and the forest's grime from my car and clothes. The memories of footprints, shadowy movements, and nights spent listening to the wind remained vivid. I realized how vulnerable I had been and how quickly isolation could become dangerous. I didn't see anyone in the cabin, and I couldn't be sure if someone had been there or if it was just a combination of fear and the environment, but the experience left me shaken. In the weeks that followed, I reviewed my journal and noticed patterns. The footprints were always around the cabin perimeter, never inside. There were no signs of forced entry. I concluded that someone had been watching, curious or suspicious, but hadn't made contact. I took steps to protect my home and learned the importance of preparedness. I also realized the value of trusting instincts and respecting isolation, especially in remote places. Looking back, the cabin trip wasn't just a test of endurance but a lesson in vigilance and caution. The fear I felt was real and grounding, reminding me of how fragile security can be when you're truly alone. The ending, when I finally drove away and reached safety, was satisfying not because the danger had been dramatic or violent, but because I survived by staying alert, thinking clearly, and taking practical steps. The clarity of survival, of returning to a normal world, was far more meaningful than any adrenaline rush or imagined confrontation. I never returned to that cabin, but I never forgot the lessons it taught me about isolation, awareness, and the subtle dangers that can hide in even the quietest places. I had been planning the trip for months, carefully saving up and mapping every detail of the route. The cabin I rented was tucked far into the mountains, off the main roads, surrounded by dense forest. I liked being alone in the woods, the way the air smelled of pine needles and wet soil, and the quiet that came from being far from any town. I had a feeling of freedom that I didn't get anywhere else. I had arrived in the late afternoon, my car barely making it up the narrow gravel road that twisted through the trees. The sun was already low, casting long shadows across the forest floor. The cabin looked exactly like it did in the photos. A small wooden structure with a steep roof, darkened windows, and a stone chimney. Smoke from the fireplace in the cabin was curling into the evening air, which made me realize that someone might be living there already, though I had booked it privately. I parked in front of the cabin, my tires crunching on the gravel. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional bird calling or the rustle of leaves in the wind. I took a deep breath, feeling the cold air fill my lungs. I carried my backpack, heavy with supplies, and opened the cabin door. The smell of old wood and damp earth hit me immediately. The interior was small but cozy, with a wooden table, a few chairs, a wood stove, and a bed in the corner. I set my backpack down, unloaded my gear, and started a fire in the stove. The warmth spread slowly through the room, and I sat down on the edge of the bed, staring at the flames. I had my plans for the evening. I wanted to explore the surrounding area a little before dark, to get my bearings and see where the nearest stream and trails were. The sun was almost gone, and the sky turned a deep orange, then purple, then the soft black of night. I grabbed my flashlight, checked the batteries, and stepped out. The forest looked different in the dim light, shadows stretching unnaturally from every tree. The air was cooler than I expected, carrying the scent of wet leaves and moss. The only sounds were my own footsteps and the distant call of an owl. I walked slowly, careful not to trip over roots or stones hidden in the undergrowth. The further I went, the thicker the trees became, their branches forming strange shapes in the weak light. I found a small clearing with a shallow stream running through it. The water glistened faintly in the remaining light, and I knelt to cup some in my hands. It was icy cold, biting at my skin. I took a few sips, feeling refreshed. I looked around, listening. The forest was alive with small movements, leaves shaking, twigs snapping under unseen animals. I felt my pulse quicken slightly, the natural fear of being alone in such a place setting in. I reminded myself that I was experienced with the outdoors, that I had been hiking and camping alone for years. Still, the feeling of being watched, even knowing rationally I wasn't, made my stomach tighten. When I returned to the cabin, darkness had settled fully. I locked the door behind me, checked the windows, and felt a momentary relief at the barrier between me and the forest. I ate a simple dinner of canned beans and bread, then settled near the fire. I kept my flashlight close, my backpack near the door, and my knife within reach on the table. I told myself it was just precaution, that nothing could get to me here. But the sound of wind moving through the trees, combined with the creaks of the old cabin, kept me alert. Every noise felt amplified, the water moving in the stove, a branch brushing the roof, the sound of my own breathing. Later in the night, I went to sleep, though it was fitful. The cabin's walls were thin, and every sound seemed to penetrate the quiet. I woke several times, convinced I heard someone walking outside. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there were moments when the pattern of the sound suggested deliberate movement. I stayed still, listening, heart racing, until the noise stopped. I eventually drifted back to sleep, exhausted but uneasy. The next morning, I woke early. The sun was just breaking over the mountaintops, spilling light through the trees. I stepped outside to stretch, and the fresh air was invigorating. The forest looked different in daylight, less threatening, more alive with detail. Birds flew overhead, the stream glittered in the sun, and I felt more relaxed. I took a long walk, following a faint trail I had spotted the day before. The trail led deeper into the forest than I had gone the previous evening, and I made mental notes of landmarks so I wouldn't get lost. I moved carefully, aware of the uneven terrain, roots, and rocks that could trip me up. As the day went on, I spent time chopping wood, stacking it neatly beside the cabin, and checking my supplies. I maintained a mental checklist of essentials: water, food, firewood, flashlight batteries. I kept my knife handy, just in case. I felt secure, confident in my ability to handle the wilderness. But there was an underlying tension, a small knot in my stomach that refused to ease entirely. Being alone in such an isolated place always brought that. That evening, something unusual happened. I was outside gathering more wood, carrying it back in a small pile, when I noticed footprints in the soft dirt near the cabin. They weren't mine. They were fresh, small but deep, suggesting a person or something heavier had walked through. My first reaction was disbelief. Maybe I had misremembered the ground, or perhaps an animal had left strange marks. I examined them carefully, They were definitely human. My heart sank. I had locked the cabin, had no reason to expect visitors, and the nearest town was miles away. The footprints stopped abruptly at the edge of the clearing. There were no signs of forced entry at the cabin. I took a deep breath, forcing calm. I told myself it was probably a hiker who had walked nearby earlier, unaware of the cabin. I double-checked the locks, closed all windows, and set a small trap. A few sticks balanced near the entrance to alert me if someone tried to open the door. I also placed my backpack and knife strategically so that I could grab them quickly. I felt tense, but I tried to focus on practical measures rather than fear. The night was long. Every sound made me flinch. The wind through the trees sounded sharper. The branches scratching the roof felt closer. At one point, I heard something moving near the back of the cabin, something deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it through the windows, but all I saw were shadows moving with the wind. I stayed awake most of the night, listening, watching, ready to react if necessary. The next morning, I decided to take a longer hike, hoping to clear my mind and regain confidence. I followed a trail leading up the mountain. The path was narrow, steep in places, and covered with loose stones. The forest opened occasionally, offering views of distant mountains and valleys below. The air was crisp and clean, filling my lungs with every breath. I felt better as I walked, telling myself that being active would help distract from fear. Around midday, I reached a small ridge with a view over the forest. The sunlight was strong, and I could see for miles. The mountains rolled in layers of green and brown, and a small river wound its way through the valley. I took a moment to sit on a rock, drinking water and eating a snack. The beauty of the scene calmed me, reminded me why I had chosen this trip. But as I prepared to head back, I noticed something alarming. In the distance, near the edge of the forest, I could see someone moving. They were dressed in dark clothing, moving deliberately through the trees, coming closer to my cabin. Panic threatened to rise, but I stayed calm, observing. I knew the nearest road was still far, and I had no immediate way to call for help. I decided to return quickly but quietly. I retraced my steps, moving carefully so as not to make noise, and kept a clear line of sight to the figure in the distance. By the time I reached the cabin, the person had disappeared from sight. I checked all windows and doors again and made sure the firewood I had stacked did not block exits. That night, I barely slept. I sat by the fire, flashlight ready, knife in hand, listening to every sound. The forest seemed alive with movement, shadows shifting, leaves rustling, branches cracking. At one point, I saw a shadow pass by the window, quick, deliberate, human-shaped. I froze, heart pounding. I didn't move until it had passed. The night stretched endlessly, and when morning finally came, I felt drained but alive. Over the next day, I focused on preparation. I gathered extra firewood, checked my food and water, and made sure I had a clear exit plan. I marked the trail carefully, noting landmarks in case I had to leave quickly. I also made a conscious effort to stay calm, focusing on practical survival skills rather than fear. The forest, though still imposing, felt less threatening when I had plans and preparations in place. By the third day, the forest felt more familiar. I learned the rhythms of the wind, the sounds of animals moving through the trees, the way sunlight shifted across the cabin. I explored further, mapping the streams and small clearings. I built small defenses around the cabin, extra branches to make noise if anyone approached, and a secure place for food so that animals couldn't get it. I felt more confident, capable, ready for any situation. One evening, I noticed something unusual. A set of small, scattered items near the edge of the clearing. They looked like remnants from a campsite. A few empty cans, a torn piece of cloth, footprints leading away. They didn't seem recent, but they were a reminder that other people had been in these woods. I felt uneasy at first but realized that these were the kind of things I had to accept when staying in the wilderness. I cleaned up what I could, keeping the area tidy, and returned to the cabin with renewed focus on safety. The following days passed without incident. I established a routine: waking early, checking the cabin, exploring nearby trails, preparing meals, and keeping watch. My fear had not disappeared entirely, but it had transformed into cautious awareness. I felt a sense of competence and control, knowing that I could handle emergencies and unexpected visitors. Toward the end of my trip, I decided to hike to a small waterfall I had noticed on the map. The trail was steep and covered in loose rocks, but I moved carefully. The waterfall was beautiful, cascading over mossy rocks into a clear pool. I sat on a large rock nearby, taking in the scene, feeling a deep sense of satisfaction and relief. I had survived the isolation, the uncertainty, and the fear. I had faced real risks and come through them with my wits and preparation. When it was time to leave, I packed everything carefully, making sure not to leave any trace behind. I double-checked the cabin, ensuring the fire was out, the doors locked, and the area clean. I drove down the gravel road, sunlight warming the car, the forest receding behind me. I felt proud of what I had accomplished. Solitude, self-reliance, and careful observation. I had faced fear, uncertainty, and isolation, and I had emerged safe, calm, and in control. I returned home exhausted but invigorated. The experience stayed with me, not as a story of terror, but as a story of resilience, skill, and respect for the wilderness. I had learned that preparation, vigilance, and careful planning could turn fear into empowerment. I knew I would return to the mountains, but I would do so with even more respect and awareness of what it meant to be truly alone in the woods. The cabin, the forest, the trails, they were no longer intimidating. They were a test I had passed, a challenge I had met with intelligence and patience. I hadn't planned to spend the night at the cabin, not really. It was supposed to be a short trip, just a few days away from everything, from the city, from people, from noise. I was craving quiet, the kind that presses against your ears and leaves only your own thoughts echoing. I drove all morning through winding forest roads, the tires crunching over loose gravel, the smell of wet pine pressing through the open window. The cabin was tucked deep in the woods, further than I thought it would be. GPS lost signal hours ago, and by the time I reached the final turn, I was relying on memory of landmarks I had seen on the map and the shapes of the trees. The cabin itself was small, made of old logs darkened by years of weather. Moss covered parts of the roof and the windows were dusty, but I didn't mind. The isolation was part of the charm. The surrounding forest was dense, thick with pines and birch, their trunks crowded together, the ground soft with needles and fallen leaves. A small stream ran a few meters from the porch, water clear and cold, and the air smelled damp, earthy, and clean in a way the city never was. I parked, carrying the few bags I had packed. Food, a small stove, water, some blankets, and enough firewood to last a week. I hadn't told anyone I was coming here. The solitude was meant to be absolute. I unlocked the door, and the smell hit me first. Old wood, dust, faint mildew. Not unbearable, just real. The inside was simple. A small kitchen, a living area with a wood stove, and a loft bedroom. The furniture was minimal, mostly old, functional pieces. A table, chairs, a small couch, some shelves with a few forgotten items, books, a tin or two, a broken lamp. I made a mental note to clean a bit and then set about arranging my things. The first night was uneventful. I built a fire, ate a small meal, and sat by the window, watching the darkness grow between the trees. There was no moon, and the forest was almost black, the silhouettes of branches like skeletal hands reaching out. I reminded myself to stay calm. It was just isolation, nothing more. Still, I couldn't help the tension creeping along my spine. Every small sound, the groan of the cabin settling, the whistle of wind through a crack, a distant rustle in the woods, made me turn my head. I kept a flashlight on the table beside me, knowing I might need it. Morning came slow. Mist hung low over the stream, curling around the trees. I could see deer tracks leading toward the water, the impressions clear in the damp soil. I took a deep breath and decided to explore a bit, walking slowly along the edge of the forest, careful not to step on anything brittle that might give away my presence. The deeper I went, the more alive the forest felt. Birds flitted in the canopy, unseen but heard, and squirrels darted across the underbrush. For a while, I felt almost at peace, alone but not afraid. It was the second night when things began to feel off. The wind had picked up, rattling the windows in uneven rhythms. I had gone to collect more firewood before dark, and the path back had seemed longer than it should have, shadows clinging to every tree like they were moving when I wasn't looking. When I entered the cabin, I noticed the front door, which I had locked earlier, was slightly ajar. I was certain I had locked it. I remember checking. My stomach sank. I searched the cabin methodically, every corner, every shadow, but nothing was out of place. Still, the air felt heavier, the silence more suffocating. I slept lightly, keeping the axe I had brought for wood chopping beside my bed. By the third day, the cabin felt different. The isolation that had felt freeing now weighed down on me. I found myself double-checking every window, every lock, and every corner of the cabin. I began hearing things that didn't make sense. A soft tapping at the windows, like branches but too rhythmic to be random. Footsteps on the porch when I was certain no one was outside. Once, I thought I saw movement through the corner of my eye, glimpses of a figure among the trees, but when I looked directly, there was nothing. I tried to rationalize. Bears sometimes wandered close to human structures. Maybe a neighbor from a distant cabin had come by. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks. But even as I reasoned, the tension gnawed at me, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I started sleeping in clothes, axe within reach, flashlight beside me, and a large kitchen knife on the floor by the bed. The turning point came in the fourth night. A storm had rolled in, the kind that seemed to shake the forest itself. Rain pounded the roof, heavy and steady, and wind bent the trees until their tops scraped against each other. Lightning illuminated the cabin in sudden, harsh flashes, and thunder rattled the walls. I stayed near the stove, lighting fire after fire, trying to keep warm, trying to feel safe. Then, amidst the storm, I heard it, deliberate knocking from outside. Not a branch, not a falling object, but controlled, rhythmic, heavy. I froze, listening, heart thudding. The knocking continued for a few minutes. I stayed still, trying to tell myself it was the storm, something loose being blown against the cabin, but every instinct screamed that it wasn't natural. I grabbed the flashlight and axe, and I moved to the door, testing the lock. It held firm. The knocking stopped. Silence. Then, from the back of the cabin, another knock, softer but unmistakable. I edged toward the back, every step cautious, every muscle taut. I checked the windows. Nothing. The rain blurred everything outside. Sleep didn't come. I stayed awake all night, huddled near the fire, the axe across my lap, eyes flicking to every shadow. I didn't hear the knocking again that night, but I felt it, the sensation of being watched, of someone or something lingering just outside the range of vision. By morning, the storm had passed. The forest was drenched, water dripping from leaves, pooling along the forest floor. I decided I had to leave, not because I thought I would be harmed necessarily, but because the cabin had lost the feeling of safety. The isolation that had seemed peaceful now felt suffocating, threatening. I packed methodically, checking every corner before I left, making sure I hadn't left anything behind. I carried extra firewood in case of a sudden rainstorm on the road, but I didn't linger. The hike back to the main road was slower than expected. The rain had softened the path, making the ground slippery. The forest was quiet now, too quiet, like it had held its breath. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see a figure following, but there was nothing. When the trees finally thinned and the gravel road appeared, relief washed over me. The sound of my car engine was a comfort, mechanical and predictable. I reached the paved highway after what felt like hours, and finally, for the first time in days, I felt safe. I stopped at a small diner on the edge of town, shaking, still on edge, scanning the parking lot, scanning the woods beyond the highway. I realized I hadn't taken anything valuable with me. Nothing of real worth had been disturbed. That cabin had just changed something in me. I understood then that isolation could make the mind twist, that fear could make shadows out of nothing, and that the forest was indifferent to human presence. It didn't care, it didn't notice, but it could make a person feel like they were losing their grip on reality. Weeks later, I returned to the city, re-entered the hum of everyday life, and tried to forget the cabin. But the memory never left completely. Every time I hear a sudden knock at my door, every time the wind rattles a window, the sensation returns. Someone or something is outside, waiting, patient, just beyond sight. I know now that it wasn't supernatural. It wasn't magical. It was simply real life, nature, isolation, the way fear can distort even the familiar. And I also know that when I left, I survived. I made careful choices, stayed calm when panic threatened, and eventually escaped unharmed. That clarity gives me comfort. I never went back to that cabin, but I understand it better now. The forest is quiet, patient, and completely indifferent, and fear is what makes it terrifying. Even now, I take extra care when traveling to remote places. I check every lock, I carry tools, I plan my route, and I never, ever underestimate the effect of being alone in a place where the world seems to vanish. That cabin taught me more about fear, awareness, and survival than any book, movie, or story could. It was terrifying, but it was real. And most importantly, I came out of it alive. And that, I tell myself, is a good ending. It started on a late autumn afternoon when I decided to take a break from the city. I needed the kind of isolation that only a cabin deep in the woods could give. Somewhere I could be completely alone, disconnected from screens, people, and schedules. I had found a small, secluded cabin listed online, tucked away in the mountains about a 3-hour drive from the nearest town. The images showed a rustic wooden structure, surrounded by dense pine trees, with a narrow trail leading up to it. From the pictures, it looked peaceful. I didn't know at the time just how dangerous peace could feel when it meant being utterly alone. I drove for hours along winding roads, the kind where trees leaned over the asphalt so heavily that sunlight barely broke through. There was no traffic, and I could see the fog forming between the trees as the sun started to dip below the horizon. I carried a backpack with food, water, extra clothes, a flashlight, a basic first aid kit, and a hunting knife. I didn't pack for comfort. I packed for survival in case something went wrong. My car's GPS lost signal halfway through, and I relied on the map printed from my computer. That added a quiet tension, but I told myself I was prepared. By the time I reached the cabin, the light was dimming to gray. The trees cast long shadows over the dirt path. I parked and got out, carrying my bag. The cabin was exactly as it appeared online, with peeling brown paint and a small porch with a rickety railing. The smell of damp wood and pine filled the air. The door creaked when I opened it, and dust rose in tiny clouds. Inside, it smelled of old wood and something slightly sour, like mold, but not enough to be unbearable. There was a small fireplace, a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, and a bed in the corner. The floorboards groaned under my weight, but they seemed solid. I set my bag down and unpacked the essentials. I found a stack of firewood in the corner and a matchbox on the table. The sun had nearly set, and the forest was sinking into darkness, though the sky still had a faint glow of orange behind the mountains. I gathered the wood and started a fire in the fireplace. The flame flickered and cast moving shadows across the walls, giving life to the shadows of furniture and tools stacked in corners. The room warmed slowly, and I felt some relief, thinking that at least I had heat and light. After the fire was stable, I checked the windows. They were simple panes, old but intact. No bars, no locks beyond the latch on the inside. I noted that I could hear the forest very clearly. The way the wind moved the branches and the occasional snapping of twigs. Maybe a deer, maybe something else. My stomach tightened, but I told myself it was normal. It was a forest. Noises were expected. I decided to stay up a bit, organizing my supplies and writing in a small notebook I brought with me. I had planned to spend 3 nights here, just me, the woods, and the cabin. As darkness settled, the forest noises grew more distinct. There was a rhythm to them. The rustle of leaves, a far-off sound of running water, the crunching of small animals. But then I noticed something different. A heavier step, slower, deliberate, not like an animal. I froze, listening. The sound stopped whenever I stopped moving, as if whoever or whatever was out there mirrored my actions. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was the wind against some fallen branches, or maybe another person had a cabin nearby. But the maps had shown no cabins in the area. The thought that someone could have been out there, watching, moving silently, made my skin crawl. I double-checked the door. Locked? Yes. Secured with the latch? Yes. I sat by the fire, knife on the table within reach, and tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Hours passed, and sleep became impossible. Every sound outside made me tense. The forest seemed to breathe around me, alive in a way that wasn't friendly. I went to the window once, pressing my face close to the glass, trying to see beyond the shadows. There was nothing, just trees moving gently, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had passed just beyond sight. Around midnight, the fire died down, leaving a low heat and flickering shadows. I checked the fireplace again, adding more wood. That's when I heard the crunch again, this time from the side of the cabin. Slow, deliberate, my pulse raced. I grabbed the flashlight and carefully opened the door, peeking outside. The porch was empty. The forest stretched in every direction, dark and silent except for a faint wind. I stepped down slowly onto the ground, trying to follow the sound, but there was nothing. No footprints, no movement, only the occasional rustle of leaves. I returned inside and barricaded the door as best I could with a chair and the table. I could hear my own breathing, steady but shallow. Every few minutes I thought I heard a sound, but it never persisted. I convinced myself I had spooked myself with imagination. By the time I lay down on the bed, exhaustion was overwhelming. I was tense, alert, but I fell asleep anyway, though in short, uneasy bursts. The next morning, sunlight filtered through the trees. I felt some relief with the daylight. The forest was less frightening now, more ordinary. I went outside to inspect. There were faint tracks in the dirt leading away from the cabin. Human footprints, size unclear, disappearing into the thicker forest. I didn't follow. My mind raced with questions. Who was here last night? Was it just a local who wandered the woods? Or was it someone who had been hiding nearby, waiting? I decided it didn't matter. I couldn't confront it without backup. I spent the day collecting firewood, cooking simple meals over the fireplace, and trying to keep busy to distract myself from paranoia. By nightfall, the forest was dark again. I kept the fire going stronger than before, and I set up my knife and a heavy metal wrench near the door. I slept lightly, waking every hour, listening for movement. Night after night, the noises continued. Slow steps, sometimes far off, sometimes close. Sometimes branches snapped as if someone had jumped over logs. I never saw a person, but the sense of being watched was constant. My nerves frayed, and I started keeping a fire going at all times. I realized how unprepared I had been. No phone signal, no neighbors, no way to call for help. On the third night, the tension became unbearable. Around midnight, the slow crunching steps returned, closer than ever. I could hear someone or something moving around the perimeter of the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight, swung it toward the darkness, and saw a figure moving between the trees, stopping when I shone the light. I froze. The figure didn't move directly toward me, but it circled the cabin slowly. My heart pounded, and I thought about all the ways I could escape. My car was parked a few hundred feet down the path. I could run, but if they saw me, I would be trapped in the open. I waited, tense, considering options. Then, I noticed a glint in the moonlight, metal reflecting from their hand. Could have been a knife. My mind raced. I realized I needed to act carefully. I waited for them to move to the far side of the cabin. Then I opened the back door quietly, slipping out with my backpack and flashlight. I ran to the car, hearing the crunching behind me. Faster now, but not too fast. My adrenaline carried me through the forest path, stumbling over roots and rocks, until I reached the car. I jumped in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The figure appeared briefly in the headlights, just a silhouette, and then vanished as I accelerated down the dirt road. I didn't stop until I reached the first small town. My hands shook as I filled the tank with gas, still checking the rearview mirror. I called the local police and reported the cabin and the intruder. They said they would check it out, but I knew I wouldn't go back there. The next day, I got a friend to drive me back with supplies to retrieve my things safely. The police had investigated, and they found footprints around the cabin, but no one was there. They said people sometimes use abandoned cabins to hide or squat, and the person I encountered likely moved on when I fled. I retrieved my belongings carefully, but I couldn't shake the feeling of what might have happened if I had been slower. I never returned to that cabin. The isolation I had sought turned into a nightmare of being stalked and hunted. The forest, which I had imagined as peaceful, became a place where being alone was dangerous. But I learned lessons I still carry. Always prepare for more than just the basics. Never underestimate the possibility of other people in remote areas, and always trust your instincts when something feels wrong. In the end, I survived by staying calm under pressure, thinking logically, and acting decisively. I avoided confrontation, relied on my instincts, and made it out safely. The memory of the steps in the dark, circling the cabin, the sense of being watched, and the quiet danger of complete isolation is something I will never forget. I still go into the woods, but only with friends, a full plan, and the knowledge that nature is beautiful, but humans can make even the most peaceful place dangerous. I had been planning this trip for months, thinking it would be the perfect escape. My life had been a constant cycle of work, deadlines, and the noisy city, and I needed silence, solitude, and a place to just exist without interruption. I found a small cabin online, tucked away in the middle of the woods, miles from the nearest town. The photos made it look isolated, but cozy. Wooden beams, a small stone fireplace, and large windows that looked out into dense forest. There were no cell towers nearby, no internet, and barely any electricity. I liked that. The idea of a weekend completely cut off from everything appealed to me. The drive was long and quiet, the kind of drive where the radio slowly fades into the hum of the tires on the road and you start noticing every detail of the world passing by. As I left the last paved road behind, the gravel track got narrower and rougher. The forest grew denser, and the tall trees stretched like walls on either side of the road. I remember noticing how quiet it was. Not the peaceful, calming quiet, but a strange, heavy silence that made me hyper-aware of every small sound. The crunch of gravel under my tires, a bird cawing somewhere deep in the trees, or the rustle of leaves that might have been wind or something else. When I finally arrived, the cabin looked even smaller and lonelier than in the pictures. The porch sagged a little, the paint was faded, and a few broken window panes had been covered with cardboard. It smelled of damp wood and old earth. I carried my bag inside, setting it down on the dusty floor. I took a moment to let my eyes adjust to the dim interior. The fireplace dominated one wall, a small kitchen was tucked into the corner, and the bedroom was a single, small room with a mattress on a frame that looked older than I did. There was a single bathroom with a toilet that flushed, but the water came out brown at first, clearing after a few seconds. I unpacked slowly, trying not to let my mind wander into the weird, unsettling corners the isolation was beginning to create. I lit a few candles, mostly to keep the darkness at bay, and made a small fire in the fireplace. Sitting there, I realized how quiet it really was. I could hear my own breathing, the crackle of the fire, and very faintly, something that sounded like movement outside. Twigs snapping, a footstep? I shook my head. There was no one else around. This was the wilderness. Animals. Maybe a raccoon or a deer. My mind tried to rationalize it, but even as I told myself that, the feeling of being watched crawled over me. I spent the first night mostly awake. I'd arranged the blankets around me, trying to stay warm. Outside, the wind picked up. It whistled through the cracks in the windows and made the old trees groan and sway. Every time I thought I heard a branch breaking near the cabin, my pulse jumped. I imagined all sorts of things. Someone watching me, someone hiding nearby. I kept telling myself it was just the woods, just the wind, just animals moving around. But the fear stayed. By morning, I was exhausted, The next day, I decided to explore the area. The cabin was on a small clearing surrounded by thick woods. There was a creek nearby, shallow but fast-moving, and the ground was soft and wet from recent rains. I followed the creek for a while, noticing how easy it was to get lost. Every direction looked the same. Tall, dark trees with twisted roots and moss-covered rocks. The deeper I went, the more isolated I felt. I kept imagining eyes in the shadows, imagining someone or something was following me. I didn't see anyone, but I could feel the sensation of being watched growing stronger. When I returned, I noticed the cabin looked slightly different. The wind had knocked a branch against the side, and the door had a small scratch along the frame I hadn't seen before. I remembered locking it before I went out. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe I just missed it earlier. But the uneasy feeling in my stomach refused to let go. That night I couldn't sleep. I had learned by now that isolation had a way of changing perception. Shadows stretched differently in the candlelight. Sounds were sharper. Every small noise became a threat. I kept hearing footsteps outside, slow and deliberate. I checked the locks. Everything was fine. My mind knew that, but my body didn't. I paced the cabin, checking windows and doors repeatedly. The wind blew harder, rattling the cabin. I tried to read a book, but my focus kept slipping back to the noises outside. I got up around midnight to check the fire. That's when I saw it. A shape moving between the trees, just at the edge of the clearing. I froze, thinking my mind was playing tricks again. But then it moved again. Slow, deliberate, just standing there, watching the cabin. I couldn't see a face, but I could feel its presence. My mind raced. Was it a person? An animal? I grabbed a flashlight, but the batteries were weak. I tried calling my phone, but there was no signal. Panic set in. I thought about leaving, but it was pitch black, and I didn't know if I could make it safely down the track to the main road without being followed. I spent the rest of the night crouched near the fireplace, trying to stay as quiet and unseen as possible. Every time the shape moved, I held my breath. The night felt endless. When the first light of dawn finally broke through the trees, I looked outside. The shape was gone. I didn't see tracks. Nothing. My relief was tempered by exhaustion and the fear that it could return. During the day, I fortified the cabin as best I could. I moved furniture to block doors and windows, I sharpened a kitchen knife, and I kept the fire going to provide some sense of security. I explored further away from the cabin cautiously, making mental notes of landmarks to avoid getting lost. I noticed other signs of life, or maybe other people, in the woods. Footprints in the mud, a broken branch that looked recent, a shallow hole dug near the creek. It was impossible to know if it was natural or human, but I didn't want to stick around to find out. By the third day, I had developed a strict routine. I didn't leave the cabin at night. I moved only during the daylight hours, always keeping the surroundings in view. The sounds outside continued, the rustle of leaves, the occasional snap of twigs, but I stayed vigilant. Sleep came in short, fitful bursts. I was constantly alert. On the fourth day, I decided I couldn't stay any longer. I packed my bag carefully, making sure nothing was left behind. Before leaving, I took one last walk around the cabin to check the area. That's when I saw the signs clearly. Footprints leading from the tree-line to the cabin, circling it slowly, and then disappearing back into the woods. Someone had been watching me the entire time. My heart sank. I realized how lucky I was that they hadn't tried to come inside while I slept. I started back down the gravel track as quickly and quietly as possible, keeping to the shadows where I could. The forest seemed to close in around me. Every rustle made me jump. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. By then, I was exhausted, covered in sweat, my muscles trembling. I drove without looking back, keeping the windows up and the doors locked until I reached a gas station where I could finally call someone. Looking back, the cabin had been exactly what I was searching for. Complete isolation, silence, and a chance to disconnect. But it had also been a trap. The feeling of being watched, of someone hiding just beyond sight, made every moment terrifying. I learned that even the quietest places could hide danger, that isolation can amplify fear, and that vigilance is essential when there's no one else around. When I finally got home, I threw my bag on the floor and collapsed onto my bed. I called the local authorities, explaining the situation and giving them the cabin's location. They said they would investigate. Weeks later, I got a call confirming that the area had been frequented by a man who had been living in the woods for months, avoiding contact with anyone, and that they had apprehended him nearby. The thought that I had been so close to him, possibly under his observation the entire time, was chilling. I realized that the experience could have ended far worse, and I felt an overwhelming sense of relief that it hadn't. After that trip, I never looked at solitude the same way. I still enjoy quiet, but I have learned to respect it differently, to understand that complete isolation carries risks I had never considered before. The cabin trip gave me the perspective I needed, that fear is not always irrational, that danger can hide in plain sight, and that survival sometimes depends on vigilance, preparation, and the willingness to leave when things feel wrong. Even now, whenever I pass a dense forest or hear a branch snap behind me in a quiet place, the memory comes back. How easily a peaceful retreat can turn into a tense, dangerous situation, how quickly solitude can become vulnerability, and how much the mind notices when the body senses danger. I carry that lesson with me always, grateful that I came out of the woods in one piece. It started as a decision born from exhaustion and a need to escape. I had been working non-stop for months, and my mind was crowded with the constant noise of the city, the demands of work, and the pressure of my own expectations. The idea of going somewhere completely isolated, somewhere quiet where I could finally breathe, had planted itself firmly in my thoughts. I scrolled through cabins listed online, looking for something remote, somewhere the internet was unreliable and the phone barely worked. That's when I found it. A small wooden cabin, nestled deep in the woods, far from the main road, surrounded by nothing but trees and the occasional sound of a creek running somewhere nearby. The photos showed a rustic structure, aged but sturdy, with a stone chimney and a small porch. The description promised peace and solitude. That was all I needed to book it. I arrived late in the afternoon. The drive itself had been long, winding through country roads that shrank and twisted until I was unsure whether I had taken the right turns. My phone signal disappeared halfway through, which made me feel more isolated than I had expected. I remember the sun just beginning to dip behind the thick canopy of trees, casting long shadows across the narrow dirt road. The cabin emerged suddenly as I turned a sharp bend. Its wooden frame seemed both inviting and intimidating at the same time, like something that had existed here for decades without change. I parked my car in a small clearing in front and stepped out, stretching my stiff legs, inhaling the forest air deeply. It smelled like pine and damp earth, and I felt a small thrill of excitement mixed with apprehension. The cabin's door opened with a creak, revealing the interior that smelled of old wood and dust. I had expected that, and it didn't bother me. The main room was small but cozy, with a stone fireplace, a wooden table, and a few chairs. The windows were large enough to let in light, but thick enough that I felt protected from the outside world. I set my bags down and began to explore. There was a small kitchen with basic supplies, a bedroom with a bed that looked surprisingly comfortable despite its age, and a bathroom that was rustic but functional. Everything was simple but clean. I felt a sense of relief wash over me. Finally, I was somewhere that didn't demand anything of me, somewhere I could just exist. I spent the first few hours unpacking, organizing my things, and making the space feel like mine. I started a small fire in the fireplace. It took some effort because the wood was dry but stubborn, but eventually, the flames caught and filled the room with warmth. I watched the fire for a while, letting its steady crackle calm me. Outside, the light was fading quickly, and the forest was transforming into a shadowy maze. I tried not to think too much about it. That's when I first noticed it, the feeling of being watched. It wasn't sudden. It was subtle, a small, uneasy sensation that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself it was just the isolation, my imagination filling the empty spaces. I peered out the window. The forest was dense, and shadows pooled between the trunks. I could see nothing moving, Nothing unusual. Still, the feeling persisted. I decided to make a small dinner, something simple. I chopped some vegetables and cooked them over the fire, trying to focus on the routine. The smell of food filled the room and made me feel safer. By the time I finished eating, darkness had fully settled over the forest. I turned on a few battery-powered lanterns, casting soft light across the room, and went to bed early. Sleep did not come easily. I kept hearing faint sounds outside. The rustle of leaves, branches snapping, something moving just beyond my field of vision. I convinced myself it was animals, raccoons, deer, maybe a fox, but the sounds were too irregular, too deliberate. At one point, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the clearing, a figure slipping between trees. My heart rate spiked, and I sat frozen in bed, staring at the window. I waited, holding my breath, but the movement did not return. I told myself I must have imagined it, my mind playing tricks in the darkness. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a fitful sleep. I woke in the middle of the night to a sound that was unmistakable. Someone or something was outside, not an animal. I could hear the soft crunch of boots or shoes against the dirt, slow and deliberate. I froze. My instincts screamed at me to hide, to stay quiet, to be invisible. I considered calling the police, but I had no signal. My car was parked outside, but getting to it in the dark felt impossible. I tried to make myself calm, telling myself I might be hearing things, that maybe the sound came from the wind or a branch snapping. But then I heard another noise, a sharp tap against the cabin window. I felt my stomach drop. I grabbed the heaviest object I could find, a metal lamp, and moved silently to the window. I peered through the darkness. The glass reflected the dim light of the fire behind me, and I could just make out shadows moving near the edge of the clearing. I could not see clearly, but I knew someone was there. My mind raced through scenarios. Maybe it was a hunter, lost in the woods. Maybe it was someone else seeking a cabin to hide in. I had no way of knowing. Fear gripped me so tightly I could barely breathe. I moved to lock the doors, double-checking every latch. I realized I had left a few windows open and hurried to close them, my hands trembling. The noises outside continued, moving around the cabin, sometimes close, sometimes retreating. I did not sleep again that night. I sat in the dark, listening to the sounds of someone circling the cabin. I tried to stay quiet, to be invisible, but every sound I made, every small movement, felt amplified in the silence. Morning did not bring relief. The sun rose, filtering weakly through the trees, but the forest felt oppressive, almost watchful. I ventured outside carefully, scanning the area. There were no footprints in the dirt, no clear sign of anyone being there. Still, I could feel it. I was not alone. My first instinct was to leave, to pack my things and drive away immediately, but the roads were unfamiliar. I had come so far, driven for hours, and the cabin's location made it difficult to reach the main road without risking getting lost. I decided to wait until I could see the roads better, until the sun was higher, and I could navigate safely. The next day, I tried to keep myself occupied. I walked through the surrounding woods, taking care to note landmarks so I could find my way back. I collected some firewood, cleaned the cabin, and prepared food. Despite my efforts, I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. Shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, and every rustle in the trees made my heart jump. I began noticing small things that unnerved me. Footprints that weren't there the day before, disturbed leaves, broken branches, subtle signs that someone had been moving around the cabin. I tried to rationalize it. Animals, hunters, the wind, but the unease gnawed at me constantly. On the third night, I made a mistake. I left the cabin to fetch water from a nearby stream. The sun had already set, and I underestimated how quickly darkness could take over the woods. The trail to the stream was narrow, lined with thick underbrush, and I found myself moving slowly, carefully. I filled my water container and started back, but I noticed something strange. The trail I had used earlier seemed altered. Small twigs were broken in ways I had not done. Leaves were disturbed, and then I heard the sound again. Footsteps behind me, slow and deliberate, not matching the rhythm of any animal. I froze, trying to listen, trying to pinpoint where the sound was coming from. It stopped when I stopped. I moved again, and it moved again. Panic overtook me, and I ran, stumbling over roots and rocks, water spilling from my container. I reached the cabin breathless, heart hammering, and slammed the door shut behind me. I checked every lock and barricaded the doors and windows with whatever I could find. I realized then that I could not stay there alone any longer. I needed to leave. The next morning, I packed quickly. I gathered all my belongings, making sure nothing was left behind. I checked my car and found it as I had left it. As I started the engine and drove down the dirt road, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me. But there was nothing, just the endless stretch of forest, slowly receding behind me. When I reached the main road, the sense of danger began to fade, replaced by relief and disbelief. I stopped at a small gas station and called the police, explaining that someone had been watching me at a remote cabin. They took my report, but there was little they could do. I returned home the next day, exhausted, shaken, but safe. The experience stayed with me for a long time. I could not shake the feeling of being watched, the realization of how vulnerable I had been, how easily someone could have harmed me. I never returned to that cabin. Eventually, I learned to trust my instincts more, to respect isolation and the unknown in a way I hadn't before. I still hike and explore, but I always plan my routes. I make sure someone knows where I am, and I never go completely alone in places I cannot reach quickly. That cabin taught me a harsh lesson about isolation, about the fine line between solitude and danger, and about the unpredictable presence of other humans in spaces we think are safe. Even years later, I can still feel that uneasy tension when I think back to that night. The memory of the forest, the shadowy shapes at the edge of my vision, and the relentless sound of someone moving just beyond the cabin will always remain with me. I survived, and I made it back to safety, but the fear and the awareness of vulnerability have never left me. That cabin, those nights, were a stark reminder that isolation can be peaceful, but only when you are truly alone. I never thought I would end up in a situation like that, and yet there I was, alone in a cabin deep in the woods, feeling every sense I had sharpened to an almost painful degree. The cabin itself wasn't anything special at first glance, just a small wooden structure, one floor, a sloping roof, and a chimney that looked like it hadn't been used in years. I had rented it for a weekend to get away from the city, from the noise, from people, from everything. I thought a weekend of peace, reading, and hiking would be perfect. But by the time I realized how isolated I really was, the problems had already begun. The trip started normally. I drove the long, winding roads through the mountains, past trees so tall they seemed to scrape the sky. The air changed as I drove farther from civilization. It became crisp, clean, and heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. I remember passing a few signs warning about bears and the occasional mountain lion, but I brushed it off, thinking the odds were slim, especially this late in the season. The cabin was even further than I expected, past a long gravel path that seemed to vanish into the forest. When I arrived, the sun was starting to sink behind the peaks, and the shadows between the trees began to stretch long and dark. I didn't think much of it at the time, but the forest had a weight to it, a quiet watchfulness that made my chest tighten slightly. The cabin was as described, small but cozy, with a wood stove, a bed, a tiny kitchen, and windows that looked out into the trees. I dropped my bag, checked the stove, and lit a small fire to take the chill out of the room. Outside, the forest seemed quiet, almost too quiet, as if the normal sounds of birds or insects had been muffled. I told myself it was just the season changing, just the approach of evening, and that I was imagining it. I unpacked a few things, including a flashlight, extra batteries, some canned food, and a small first aid kit. I had wanted this trip to be relaxing, so I even brought a few books and my notebook to write in. That was the last bit of normalcy I would feel for a long time. The first night passed uneventfully, though I woke more than once to strange noises outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind or the trees settling, branches scraping against the roof or the side of the cabin. But around 3 in the morning, I heard something that didn't fit. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps moving slowly around the perimeter of the cabin. I froze, straining my ears to hear more, holding my breath. They stopped suddenly, then started again in a different spot. I didn't have a phone signal, so I couldn't call anyone. The thought of trying to run outside in the dark felt impossible. Eventually, the sounds stopped, and I lay awake, heart hammering, listening to the forest silence until morning. By daylight, the forest felt less threatening, but the sense of unease remained. I decided to explore a bit to distract myself. The cabin was at the end of a small trail that split into several paths. I walked a few hundred meters down one of them, trying to remind myself that I was in the middle of nature and that everything I feared was unlikely. The trees were massive, their trunks wide and rough, their branches twisting high above. Fallen leaves crunched underfoot, and small streams trickled through moss-covered rocks. The beauty was distracting, almost calming, until I noticed something that made my stomach turn. A set of footprints, large, deep, and human-shaped, leading from the woods directly to the cabin. They were fresh, the soil still soft, and there were no other tracks near them. I froze, my mind racing. Whoever had walked there had to have come very recently, but I couldn't see anyone. I followed the prints back to the cabin. They stopped abruptly at the edge of the door, as if the person had vanished into thin air. I spent the rest of the day inside, keeping the doors locked and the windows secured. I tried to focus on reading, on making the cabin feel like home, but I kept hearing noises. Small knocks on the walls, the scratching of twigs against the window, the occasional sound of someone breathing heavily in the distance. Each sound made me flinch. I checked the perimeter of the cabin several times, but there was no one there. I even considered leaving, but the road back was far, winding, and I didn't want to risk driving at night on it. I rationalized that it might have been animals or the wind. I hoped it was just my imagination. Night came again, and the darkness felt oppressive. I kept a flashlight and a kitchen knife close at hand. Around 2 in the morning, the noises returned, louder this time. I could hear someone walking deliberately around the cabin, pausing, then moving again. My stomach twisted into knots, and I realized I could hear something else now. Breathing, shallow and uneven, coming from somewhere very close. I moved quietly to the window and peered out into the black. My flashlight caught a glimpse of something, a shadow moving past the trees. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, maybe a deer, but the shape was wrong. It was tall, upright, slow, deliberate. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the knife. I spent the night crouched near the stove, the knife in my hand, flashlight illuminating the room in short bursts. Every sound outside made my heart leap. Every creak of the cabin floor felt like a footstep. I didn't sleep at all. I kept thinking about what I could do if someone actually tried to get in. I had no phone signal. There was no one for miles. The nearest ranger station was at least an hour away. I was completely alone, completely vulnerable. The next morning, I decided I had to get out. I packed my bag quickly, making as little noise as possible. I double-checked the cabin, locked the doors, and started down the gravel path toward the main road. I was tense, constantly scanning the tree line for movement. After a few minutes, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Footprints following mine, slightly behind, tracking every step I took. My pace quickened, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to keep calm, trying to think logically. I ran when the path widened, trying to put as much distance between myself and whoever was following me as I could. Suddenly, a branch snapped behind me. I stopped dead, frozen with fear. The sound was close, too close, and I could hear rapid footsteps moving in the leaves. I had no choice but to keep running. I stumbled over rocks, scraped my arms on branches, and almost fell several times, but I didn't stop. After what felt like an eternity, the path opened onto the main dirt road. I ran straight down it, hoping desperately to reach the nearest town. After about 20 minutes, I saw a car approaching. I ran toward it, waving my arms frantically. The driver stopped, eyes wide, and I jumped in without even explaining, too afraid to look back. I called the police as soon as I was in the safety of civilization. They drove me back to the cabin with a team to investigate. When we arrived, there was no one there. The prints around the cabin had vanished, and there was no sign of forced entry. They found nothing in the woods that explained the noises I heard or the footprints I had followed. They suggested it might have been a squatter or someone camping illegally in the forest, but nothing concrete could be proven. They assured me I had done the right thing by leaving immediately, and that the area was safe after they checked it thoroughly. Even after that, the experience stayed with me. I couldn't sleep without checking the locks multiple times, and every rustle outside my city apartment made my heart race. I avoided cabins and remote forests for years after that, sticking to places with neighbors and cell reception. But eventually, I learned to live with it, though the fear never completely went away. I realized that the most terrifying things don't have to be supernatural. Sometimes, it's just the thought that someone is out there, moving silently through the trees, waiting, watching, and you have no way of knowing if they will stay hidden or come closer. Over time, I became more cautious, more aware, and more prepared whenever I ventured into nature. I never returned to that cabin, and I never wanted to. I learned to respect the wilderness, but also to respect the possibility that other people with unknown intentions might be out there. It was a hard lesson, learned through fear, panic, and a very real sense of vulnerability. But I survived. I left the cabin behind, alive, and eventually found peace again, slowly, one cautious step at a time. I had been driving for hours, the kind of drive where the sun seems to stretch endlessly across the sky, flattening everything in a dull, oppressive light. I left the city behind early in the morning, thinking that the remoteness of the cabin I was renting would give me the peace I desperately needed. My work had been piling up for months, deadlines looming and colleagues constantly calling. I thought a weekend alone in the woods would give me clarity and rest, but I had no idea what I was truly stepping into. The road had narrowed after the highway ended, transforming into a rough gravel path that twisted between dense trees. The forest was thick here, old and stubborn, with twisted trunks and gnarled roots breaking through the earth. Every so often, I caught a glimpse of a shallow creek or a small clearing, but mostly it was endless green, the kind that seemed to press in from all sides. My car bounced over potholes, and dust clouds rose behind me, coating the windshield and leaving faint scratches on the glass. I had been told the cabin was off-grid. There would be no electricity, no internet, no cell signal. The idea had sounded exciting, almost romantic, the thought of disconnecting completely. I laughed at myself for imagining it. The trees lining the path seemed to grow taller as I drove further in, their branches stretching across the narrow road like skeletal fingers. Occasionally, I would have to swerve to avoid fallen branches or deep ruts that threatened to rip my tires. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was low, bleeding orange and red light through the trees. It was a small wooden structure, aged but solid, with a steep roof and a porch that sagged slightly on one side. The wood was dark and weathered, the edges worn by years of wind and rain. Smoke curled lazily from a metal chimney, but there was no one around. I had to pause for a moment, take in the stillness. There was a smell of damp wood and dry leaves, a mix that was pleasant yet unsettling in its isolation. The cabin was simple. A single room with a small wood stove, a rough table, and a bed in the corner with a thin mattress. Shelves lined one wall, mostly empty, save for a few cans of food, some jars of beans and rice, and a stack of firewood neatly piled near the stove. There was a small sink with a bucket of water beneath it and a few tools hanging on hooks above. I dropped my bag on the bed, the sound echoing strangely in the empty space. I spent the next hour inspecting the cabin and preparing for nightfall. I gathered firewood, checked the stove, and set up a small lantern in the center of the room. Outside, the forest was changing. Shadows were growing long and dark, and the wind had picked up, rustling leaves and bending branches in a way that made them groan. I could hear the distant call of birds heading to roost, and the occasional snap of a branch from some unseen animal moving through the underbrush. As darkness fell, the cabin seemed smaller, almost suffocating. The walls creaked occasionally, but it was the silence that unnerved me the most. There was no distant road noise, no hum of electricity, no reminder that the world extended beyond these trees. The night was thick and alive with sounds I couldn't identify. Small scuttling noises, the slap of something heavy against the undergrowth, the whisper of leaves moving with the wind. I lit the stove and sat close to it, letting the warmth seep through me, trying to shake the unease that had begun to creep in. Sleep was difficult. Every sound made me jump. A deer crashing through underbrush, the bark of a distant fox, the way the wind rattled the porch roof. My mind, starved of other stimuli for so long, began to invent noises, to exaggerate every small sound into a threat. I would close my eyes, and suddenly the shadows in the corners of the room would seem to move, or I would think I saw a figure standing just outside the window. I knew it was irrational, but my body didn't care. My heart raced constantly, and I could feel a constant tension in my muscles, waiting for something I couldn't name. On the second day, I decided to explore the surrounding forest. The cabin sat near a shallow valley, and a small dirt trail ran from the front porch into the trees. I followed it, stepping carefully over roots and stones, trying to keep track of my direction. The woods were dense, and after an hour of walking, I realized I had wandered further than I intended. The trail became less clear, fading into patches of grass and undergrowth. The sunlight filtered down through the branches in scattered beams, but even in the daytime, the forest felt heavy and confining. Then I noticed signs that I wasn't alone. Footprints, large and irregular, pressed into the damp earth. Broken branches, bent and snapped as if something large had passed through. I tried to rationalize it, maybe deer or other wildlife, but the prints were too deep, too uneven, too human-shaped. My stomach tightened, and I started back toward the cabin, but the forest had grown quiet. The usual sounds of birds and rustling undergrowth had vanished, replaced by an oppressive stillness. I hurried, trying to convince myself that I was imagining things. By late afternoon, I had returned to the cabin, sweaty and unsettled. I double-checked the locks on the door and the windows, though I knew it wouldn't stop someone determined. I sat by the stove, my nerves frayed, and tried to calm myself by making a small fire and arranging the cabin's few supplies in a neat, orderly fashion. I reminded myself that the area was remote, that few people ever came here. It was probably nothing, a trick of my imagination amplified by isolation. That night, the noises began again, louder and more persistent. There was a tapping at the window at first, faint but deliberate. My stomach dropped, and I froze, staring at the glass. Then I heard a heavy thump against the door, followed by another. My first instinct was to call out, but I knew there was no one to hear me, no one who could help. I grabbed the small axe I had brought for firewood, holding it with both hands, and waited. The night stretched on, and the thumps continued at irregular intervals. I stayed near the stove, listening, trying to track the sounds, to tell if they were moving around the cabin. Every time the wind gusted, I jumped, convinced it was someone outside. My mind was spinning, running through possibilities. Someone lost, a criminal, a desperate person seeking shelter. I thought of calling the police, but the cell signal was non-existent, and the nearest road was miles away. Morning brought little relief. The thumping had stopped, but I could see signs outside. Footprints pressed into the soft dirt, a broken branch leaning against the side of the cabin. Someone had been there. I inspected the perimeter, checking every tree and bush, but found nothing else. No one was in sight. I realized that staying in the cabin was no longer safe, that the isolation which had seemed so inviting now made me vulnerable. I packed the essentials quickly, food, water, the axe, and my bag, and prepared to leave. My plan was simple: return to the main road, find my car, and leave before anyone else appeared. I knew I had to move carefully. The person who had been at the cabin could still be nearby. I stayed low, keeping to areas where the trees offered some cover, watching every shadow, listening to every sound. The forest felt alive, watching me, and I felt like a small animal trying to escape a predator. took hours to reach the car. Every step was tense, my ears straining, my eyes scanning the undergrowth for movement. I avoided clearings, moved in zigzag patterns, and paused frequently to listen. When I finally saw the gravel road ahead, relief flooded me. I broke into a run, my legs aching, my lungs burning, until I reached the car and climbed in, locking the doors behind me. The drive back was long, and I didn't stop until I was back on the main highway, surrounded by other cars and the hum of civilization. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following, but there was no one. My hands shook on the wheel, and I could feel my heart still racing hours later. That experience stayed with me for a long time. I learned to respect the idea that isolation, no matter how peaceful it seems in theory, can be dangerous when other people with unknown intentions are involved. I realized that safety is not just about awareness, but about preparation and caution. Weeks later, I returned to check on the cabin, not out of bravery, but to see if any sign remained of what had happened. The place was empty, quiet, untouched, as if nothing had occurred. The footprints were gone, the broken branch had fallen back to the ground, and the forest had reclaimed its silence. I left quickly, realizing that the memory of fear was far more vivid than any physical trace. I never went back there again. I told myself I didn't need to. The cabin had given me exactly what it promised: solitude, clarity, and a lesson in the fragility of safety. I found peace not in revisiting the place, but in moving forward, carrying the awareness of danger and the strength it gave me. And in that way, the ordeal ended clearly. I had survived, escaped without harm, and I had learned something essential. Fear can be controlled, danger can be navigated, and life can continue after even the most terrifying experience. I could sleep again, I could plan trips safely, I could exist in the world without constant dread. The memory of that cabin, its isolation, and the unknown presence outside became a story I would carry, a reminder of vigilance, resilience, and the value of returning to safety.